senior chef looked completely drained. He let out a heavy sigh, already dreading what he was about to see. But Woojin just stood there completely unfazed. He presented his dish, a perfect-looking ratatouille. The senior chef immediately found a problem. He complained that ratatouille is supposed to be made with tomatoes, but Woojin had used yuzu instead. Woojin just calmly stated that he thought his version tasted better. This was not the answer the instructor wanted to hear. He looked like he was getting a massive headache. He pleaded with Woojin to just cook normally for once. He admitted that Woojin's knife skills were the best he'd ever seen, maybe even the best in the world. But that wasn't the point. The problem, he explained, was that as soon as Woojin started combining ingredients, it all fell apart. He patted him on the shoulder and told him to try better next time. With that, he dismissed Woojin and called for the next person. The other chefs in line just glared at our boy. Clearly, this wasn't the first time he'd caused trouble. Suddenly, one of the other chefs completely lost it. He stormed towards Woojin, absolutely furious. But all Woojin could think was, how dare this man speak to him like that? In his past life, no one would have dreamed of disrespecting the heavenly demon. He realized with frustration that his old cooking skills were completely useless here. His mind drifted back to that previous life. He remembered the legions of followers in his demonic cult, all of them cheering his name. Back then, he was the heavenly demon, the most powerful man in Murim and the first to conquer all of China. But honestly, he never cared about any of that. His real passion was cooking. He remembered presenting a dish he'd made, red pepper japki with white peach. He offered it to his men as a thank you for their hard work, explaining that conquering was just something that got in the way of his true dream. His most trusted elders just stared at the plate, completely confused by his eccentric dish. And he remembered his one true goal, to become the greatest chef in China. The memory continued. His parents had died shortly after he was born in a massive disaster. So many kids became orphans that day that he was just another face in the crowd. After that, friends of his parents took him in. Even though they already had a son named Xianho, they raised Woojin like he was their own. But that peace didn't last. His adoptive father also passed away in an accident involving a gate. He just watched as Xianho tried to comfort his mother, surrounded by the destruction. It was in that moment of trauma and loss that everything came flooding back. He remembered who he used to be. Faced with the monster that had just destroyed his new family, the power of the heavenly demon surged through him for the first time in this new life. Back in the present, he couldn't help but smile. He still couldn't quite believe this was all real. He had actually escaped the endless fighting of his old world. Now, he could finally focus on what really mattered, cooking. Standing in the kitchen, Woojin felt like everything was finally going his way. But there was one huge problem. For some reason, nobody in this world liked his food. He just couldn't figure out why. He remembered how, back in his old world, the elders loved his cooking. One of them even fainted from how incredible the flavor was. At least, that's what the others told him. But Woojin didn't let the haters get him down. He looked at his newest creation, a sausage and vegetable stir-fry, and knew it was a masterpiece. Just then, the door opened. His adoptive brother Xianho walked in carrying a huge backpack, announcing that he was home and starving. But as he took a breath, a weird smell hit him. He instantly got a very bad feeling. He looked over and saw Woojin sitting at the table, eating with a look of absolute pure happiness on his face. Xianho just stared at the piece of sausage on Woojin's chopsticks. That was the source of the smell. Xianho eyed the food with deep suspicion. He knew that smell. He asked Woojin if he'd made it himself, praying the answer was no. Woojin just smiled, proudly confirming that he did, and offered his brother a bite. Xianho completely froze. The poor guy tried to talk himself into it. He figured since Woojin was learning from a real chef now, it had to be at least edible. And besides, how badly could anyone really mess up a simple sausage stir-fry? He was starving anyway, so he decided to risk it and took the bite. It was a huge mistake. He spit it out instantly. Xianho was horrified. He was sure that if he'd actually chewed that thing, he wouldn't have survived. Xianho chugged water straight from the bottle, trying to get the taste out of his mouth. He couldn't figure it out. The vegetables weren't rotten, so what could Woojin have possibly done to make it taste that bad? That's when he saw it. On the counter was a bag of cherries. The realization hit him like a truck. He turned to Woojin, who was just calmly eating his own creation. Xianho asked him with dread in his voice if he actually put cherries in the stir-fry. Woojin's face lit up. He thought his brother finally understood his culinary vision. He proudly explained that he used cherries instead of sugar to give the dish a refreshing, natural flavor. Xianho just stared at him, speechless. He grabbed his bag and made a quick exit, telling Woojin he was going to take a shower and that he could have the rest. As his brother left, Woojin sat there alone. It had been 6 months since he remembered his past life as the heavenly demon and dedicated himself to cooking. But it wasn't going well. The people in this world just didn't get it. They hated the look, the smell, and the taste of everything he made. He was a complete failure. He just couldn't figure it out. How was he supposed to get anyone to appreciate his cooking? He took another bite. To him, it tasted incredible. He genuinely didn't understand what the problem was. Meanwhile, Xianho was in the shower, still trying to get the taste out of his mouth. He couldn't believe Woojin put cherries in a stir-fry. He thought his brother must have gone insane. He just couldn't understand how someone could ruin a dish so completely. And why was Woojin so obsessed with cooking in the first place? Because let's be real, his actual talent was something else entirely. He remembered that day clearly, the fire, the screams, the monsters everywhere. And in the middle of all that chaos, Woojin had been a blur of motion, effortlessly taking down the creatures. That was his real talent. He wasn't a chef, he was a monster in a fight. Xianho remembered Woojin standing there, completely unfazed by the fire and destruction around them. It was in that moment that everything clicked into place for him. He was sure of it. That was the day Woojin awakened his powers. Xianho knew his own abilities were nothing compared to his brother's. With the right training, Wu Jin could easily become a S-rank hunter. If Wu Jin became a hunter, they could fight monsters together. They could finally get revenge for what happened to their father. But back in the present, Wu Jin was dealing with a very different situation. A small, fairy-like creature was having an almost religious experience over his food, going on about the perfect mix of sweet, salty, and spicy. She was so happy she was crying, claiming it was the second most delicious thing she had ever tasted in her life. Wu Jin was a little thrown off. The second time he thought about the dish, it was just a simple stir-fry with sausage and vegetables. To bring a basic recipe to this level of flavor, it had to be the sauce. He realized the secret to the amazing taste was definitely in the sauce. Wu Jin was impressed. This little creature really knew her food. She asked him for the name of the dish he'd made. He told her it was a cherry sausage stir-fry. The spirit shouted the name, realizing that the incredible taste had to be coming from either the sausage or the cherries. Wu Jin finally asked her who she was. The little creature paused her chewing to prepare her grand introduction. She announced that she was the spirit of the secret tome, a being connected to a specific powerful item. She explained that spirits like her form contracts with humans to help them grow stronger. Her item, she declared, was the dungeon chef's secret tome. The spirit went on a rant, saying she was born to fix the world's terrible food and ignorant taste buds. Miles away, some random chef suddenly felt his ears tingling, wondering if someone was talking trash about him. Back with Wu Jin, the spirit continued her pitch. She boasted that she had access to dozens of recipes for dishes that didn't even exist in this world. She told him that if he mastered all of them, he would be able to create the legendary ultimate dish. Wu Jin listened, his expression turning serious. This was a huge deal. The little spirit floated in front of Wu Jin and declared that her entire existence was for one single purpose: to create the legendary ultimate dish. She explained that she'd met countless chefs over the years, but none of them were good enough. They couldn't recreate her recipes, and honestly, their cooking was just awful. But she said with a grin that all changed the moment she met him. Wu Jin had no idea what she was talking about. She explained that after tasting his food, she finally understood. He was the one who could actually create the ultimate dish. So she looked him right in the eyes and asked if he would become her contractor. But then she stopped. She remembered that she was an item that Xianho had brought with him. She figured that meant Xianho should be the one to make the contract. She shrugged, explaining that it's not like she'd actually made a contract with him yet, so it was still an open question. Wu Jin told the little spirit that her offer was a good one, but he had some conditions. Suddenly, a huge pillar of light shot down from the ceiling, surrounding them both. The conditions had been met. Then the system messages started flooding in. A seal on an item had been lifted. He'd acquired something called the Dungeon Chef's Secret Tome, and it had chosen him as its owner. On top of all that, he'd just been given a new non-combat class, Dungeon Chef. He just stared completely stunned. A Dungeon Chef, what was that? The little spirit was ecstatic, telling him they were officially contractors now. She told him to check out the Secret Tome. But when he looked at the screen, the legendary item was only cooking level 1. And worse, he didn't have the right to view any of the recipes or quests. He read the words again just to be sure. Cooking level 1, no right to view recipes. He, the man who conquered the entire martial world, didn't have the rights to see a cookbook. This was insulting. The little spirit saw the look on his face and immediately started panicking. She quickly explained that it was the tome's level, not his. It wasn't saying he was bad at cooking, she just needed him to calm down. The spirit quickly tried to calm him down, explaining that the level wasn't a judgment of his skill. It was the tome's level, just a way to track his learning process. She told him he could raise the cooking level by making dishes from the recipes or by clearing quests. The higher the level, the more recipes he'd get access to. But there was a catch. The recipes in the secret tome used ingredients found inside dungeons. Since he couldn't enter dungeons yet, the book was basically saying he didn't have the right to see anything. Wu Jin's expression changed. So all he needed to do was become a hunter, and then he'd be able to see the recipes. She confirmed that was exactly right. He had to climb the tutorial tower and officially become a hunter. That would unlock everything for him. The tutorial tower. Wu Jin remembered his friend Xianho mentioning that it only opens up every 3 months. A small smile formed on his face. His path was clear. The next day, he headed out. The chef was thinking about what happened with Wu Jin yesterday. He wondered if he'd been too hard on him, but quickly decided it was something that needed to be said. He admitted that besides his weird choice of ingredients, Wu Jin was a perfect chef. The guy did the work of 3 people all on his own. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Wu Jin, which was pretty rare. Feeling a little bad about yesterday, the chef opened it. He couldn't believe it. Wu Jin was quitting. Meanwhile, Wu Jin himself wasn't looking back. His path was set. So after this massive disaster called the Gate Incident, everything changed. People's bodies started to transform, and they became hunters who could use a special power called mana. The thing is, nobody really knew what mana was. But then, these mysterious towers started popping up all over the world. Turns out, climbing these towers was the only way to learn how to use this new power. The inside of the tower was never the same twice. It was packed with traps and monsters, and you had to overcome all of it to master mana. This is the tutorial tower. And even though it was incredibly dangerous, more and more people started showing up every year, desperate to become hunters. Everyone was chasing the money and fame that came with the title. People were so desperate they'd spend millions on guidebooks just for a shot at climbing the tower. And just like that, a trial would begin. A hunter aspirant looked up as a giant green slime monster started forming right above him. The creature lunged and the guy reacted instantly, kicking it away. He landed on his feet and got into a low stance, ready for whatever the monster was going to do next. He dodged and then slammed his fist right into the monster's core. The creature exploded, splattering green goo everywhere. He stood there exhausted but successful, waiting to see what he got. But all that dropped was a slime core and a couple vials of slime fluid. He let out a scream of pure frustration. This was Young Tisik, and it was his 10th time attempting the tutorial. He was furious, complaining that he'd taken down 4 monsters and still hadn't gotten a single weapon drop. He couldn't understand why other people got weapons right away while he got nothing. He dropped to his knees, completely dejected. All he ever got was this useless poisonous slime fluid. The poor guy complained that he'd been there 10 times and even spent a fortune on a guidebook all for nothing. He finally just collapsed onto the floor. He decided he needed a break for at least an hour just to feel better. Actually, scratch that. He figured he'd worked hard enough to deserve 2 hours off. At this rate, he was going to be too exhausted to even climb the tower anyway. As he was lying there, Young Tisik noticed that someone else had just shown up. He let out a bitter laugh, complaining that all sorts of people were showing up now. He started mocking the new arrival for not even wearing basic leather armor. Tisik asked if the guy thought the tutorial tower was some kind of joke. And that's when Woojin appeared in a flash of light, the little spirit floating right beside him. But Woojin wasn't paying attention to the guy on the floor. He was amazed by the teleportation, thinking it was even better than the methods used in his old world. The spirit pointed out that his clothes were completely different from everyone else's, and that's when it hit him. He thought back, it had been half a year since he'd regained his memories. He really believed he'd gotten used to this new society. But looking around, he realized he was wrong. While other hunters were getting taken down by slime monsters, he was the only one dressed like he was just out for a walk. Their clothes, their gear, he was nothing like them. While Woojin was lost in thought, other hunters were busy fighting. One of them screamed at his buddy to grab the loot before anyone else could. Suddenly, a huge slime monster lunged right for Woojin. The guy on the ground, Tisik, yelled out a warning for him to watch out. But Woojin just stood there. With a single, almost lazy flick of his hand, he sliced the entire monster in half. He was starting to think maybe he should have brought some armor just to fit it. The slime dissolved into nothing, leaving behind a few items and a sword. That's when a blue window popped up right in front of him. The system was asking if he wanted to register the new ingredients he'd just found into his recipe book. He looked down at the items on the floor. A slime core, some slime fluid, and a sword. He realized these were the ingredients from the slime he just took down. Before he could do anything, a group of thugs showed up. They told him to back off and not touch the items. Woojin didn't even look at them. He was too busy thinking about the ingredients for his recipe book. The thug got furious, screaming and asking if he was being ignored. One of the thugs tries to act tough, telling Woojin to get lost. He even tries to name drop their leader Yongshik like that's supposed to mean something. The clown keeps running his mouth, telling Woojin to drop the items and leave. Meanwhile, the little spirit looks up at her chef, clearly worried. But Woojin just stands there, completely unimpressed. Honestly, he finds the whole situation ridiculous. He thinks back to his old life when entire nations trembled before him. Now he's getting pushed around by these nobodies. He picks up the sword from the ground, deciding it's usable. It's not great, but he figures it should be enough to get him through the tutorial tower. Seeing him pick up the sword, the thugs get ready to jump him. Hilariously, one of the guys starts getting nervous. He asks Yongshik if they're sure about this, because Woojin looks like he actually wants to fight. The leader Yongshik tries to sound tough, saying getting hurt is no big deal, but he's clearly worried. He points out that it would lower their chances of clearing the tower, and they already wasted a bunch of money on a guidebook. Yongshik cuts his nervous friend off. He's done talking. He just tells his guys to surround Woojin. The leader keeps trying to talk tough, reminding them that it's 3 against 1. His guys start to move, getting into position. Woojin just watches them spread out. He's not worried at all. He notes that they're trying to surround him like it's some brilliant plan. He's almost impressed in a sarcastic way. He thinks to himself that at least these clowns know the basics of fighting. With the signal given, Yongshik charges forward. He swings his weapon straight down at Woojin's head. But Woojin moves like he's not even there. He sidesteps the clumsy attack and in the same motion slices the guy's arm clean off. The weapon goes flying. The thug's eyes roll back in his head from the sheer pain and shock. His friends can only scream his name in horror. The fight was over in a single move. Our boy didn't even break a sweat. Woojin didn't even pause. He snatched the weapon right out of the air and immediately turned on the next guy. The move was so fast, it was like he'd been holding it the whole time. He swung it with terrifying speed. The second thug barely had time to react, stumbling backward in a panic. The last guy just froze, looking up as the weapon came crashing down towards his head. He started stammering, trying to get Woojin to stop. The guy pleaded with him, asking to talk it out, but it was way too late for that. The weapon slammed into the ground with incredible force, pinning the man's shirt to the floor. Woojin had missed on purpose. Suddenly, a tiny spirit appeared out of thin air. She stared at Woojin, completely stunned by the violence, and called out to the chef. The little spirit was completely stunned, asking what on earth just happened. All 3 of the thugs were unconscious on the ground. Woojin just stood there, perfectly calm. He thought to himself that if this were his old world, he would have ended them the second they charged. But he had to remember, he wasn't the heavenly demon anymore. He knew he had to live by the laws of this world now. With that settled, he told the spirit it was time to go. They made their way into the tutorial tower. Woojin asked the spirit if he was the only one who could see her. She confirmed it, but added that people who also have a secret tome can see each other's. A blue window popped up, asking if he wanted to register an ingredient he'd found. He asked the spirit if it was okay to press yes. She told him he could register items even before becoming an official hunter. So he pressed yes. The system confirmed that slime fluid was now a registered ingredient. And with that, he could finally see some recipes that used it, like slime pudding and slime-a-da. He thought the slime ingredient looked a bit like bubble tea. He decided to check the recipes in order, but when he clicked on one, he saw he was denied access. He still needed more ingredients to see the full recipe. The little spirit nervously tried to explain that, just like yesterday, he couldn't access the recipes yet. Woojin just stared at the screen, completely unfazed. She started panicking, trying to make it clear that this wasn't the tome's fault. The issue was that he wasn't an official hunter. She looked absolutely terrified of his reaction. Turns out she had a long history of picking terrible contractors. They'd called her book an assassin's guide and said her recipes would get people eliminated. After all those failures, she had finally found him, a perfect chef. She was not about to lose this one, so in a moment of pure desperation, she launched herself at him, headbutting him right in the face while screaming for him not to break the contract. Woojin was completely stunned. The little spirit just floated there, sobbing and begging him again not to break the contract. He just looked at her, confused, and asked if she was okay. He explained that all he wanted to know was if it was all right to cook a new recipe that wasn't even listed in the book. The spirit stopped crying instantly. She just stared at him, completely shocked by his question. He calmly explained his plan. He was going to create a new recipe. What was the point of just following the same old methods someone else wrote down? The spirit was speechless. She asked if he really meant that if he wasn't going to break the contract. Woojin told her to stop crying, explaining that he'd never even thought about it. He just thought it was strange that he didn't have access. He assured her he didn't have any complaints. Her entire mood shifted. She told him that in the thousands of years she's existed, she's seen countless people. But our boy was the very first chef who ever said they would cook without a recipe. With that settled, Woojin turned towards a dark entrance. He figured they'd see how it goes. It was time to move. He walked through the stone hallway, his expression completely serious. But then he stopped. He looked back into the darkness, telling the spirit he felt like someone was following them. And he was right. A shadowy figure was pressed against the wall, watching them from a distance. The spirit was just relieved he hadn't broken their contract. She then complained about being hungry, telling Woojin to just deal with it. But the watcher was stunned. He couldn't believe a contractor of the secret tome was actually inside the tutorial tower. This was the guy who'd been following them. He watched Woojin from the shadows, his expression intense and unreadable. Woojin found a jar of green goo, probably a slime byproduct. Without a second thought, he dipped his finger in to taste it. The spirit completely lost it, screaming at him not to eat that. She frantically explained that slime goo is basically an instant poison. It wouldn't take him out, but it would definitely mess up his stomach. But Woojin didn't seem to care. He just stood there chewing thoughtfully while the spirit watched, completely confused. He calmly analyzed the taste. At first, it was just sweet, which he thought would be boring. But then a sharp bitterness and spiciness kicked in, which actually balanced it out perfectly. The spirit couldn't believe it. He was totally fine. Woojin just kept talking, saying the goo would be great for making desserts or even marinating meat. She was just glad he wasn't hurt. Still a little nervous, she asked him what kind of dish he was even planning to make with it. He explained his plan. Since the goo had an instant poison, he just needed a way to get rid of it. His solution was simple. Use his own heat energy to burn the poison out completely. A bright orange flame erupted in his palm. This wasn't just for fighting, this was a cooking tool. He held the slime goo, ready to start his little experiment. But the plan had a second step. After burning it, he'd immediately use cool energy to absorb all the heat. He switched from fire to ice in an instant, surrounding the goo with a cold aura. The slime hardened into a solid green jelly. He looked it over, wondering if it had set properly. And of course, the only way to find out for sure was to taste it. He took a bite. He chewed thoughtfully. The texture was perfect, and more importantly, the poison was completely gone. The experiment was a success. After a moment, Woojin announced that he'd figured out what dish to make. The little spirit looked up at him, her eyes wide with anticipation. He told her his grand idea. He was going to make red bean paste jelly. The spirit was completely baffled. He confirmed it, and to make his jelly, he was going to need a whole lot more slime. He figured he'd need quite a few ingredients for this recipe. With that, they headed deeper into the dungeon. The hallway was lit by old torches, casting long shadows on the stone walls. He kept moving forward until he came to a long, arched corridor. The floor was littered with old, broken weapons. It looked like a graveyard for failed adventurers. He scanned the pile, looking for anything that might be useful. The guy following them finally came out of the shadows. He walked over to the pile of weapons Woojin had ignored, and something immediately felt off. He picked up a spear. The wooden shaft wasn't in great shape. But even so, it was still a decent weapon to find in a place like this, which made it even weirder. This guy had ignored all the good stuff and only took the byproducts from the slimes. A worn-out axe and old club, all just left on the floor. The more he tried to understand it, the stranger it all seemed. He tried to make sense of it. Weapons were a rare drop, but the slime parts dropped 2 or 3 at a time. So was that it? Was this guy just collecting trash items from slimes for some reason? The watcher was completely stumped. He just couldn't figure out why anyone would do this. Then it clicked. The slime parts were full of a toxin that made people sick. There was only one reason someone would ever collect that stuff inside the tutorial tower. He was after the tower's hidden piece. But the thing is, at this point in time, nobody was supposed to know about that item. A chilling thought crossed his mind. Could it be that the future had already been changed? The idea was so insane he couldn't accept it. That was it, he took off sprinting down the corridor. He had to get to the contractor of the secret tome. He cursed himself for waiting so long. He had no idea who this guy was, and that could ruin everything. The hallway opened up into a dark, empty room. And then the guy who'd been following them came running out of the passage. He was breathing hard, clearly in a hurry to catch up. Woojin and the spirit had already turned to face him. The newcomer stopped, looking around the massive room. The floor was covered with a grid of random, low-level items. The spirit asked Woojin if this was the person who was stalking them. Woojin didn't answer. He just looked the guy over, a calm expression on his face. The two of them stood in silence, just staring at each other. The newcomer's eyes were locked onto the little floating spirit. His internal monologue confirmed it. He knew exactly what she was. Woojin, on the other hand, just stood there completely unfazed. Our boy then turned his back on the guy like he wasn't even there. The watcher was now certain this was the one. Watched Woojin, his expression growing more and more serious. That's when he noticed the floor. The area around Woojin was completely empty of items. It meant he was the one who had taken down all the slimes. As Woojin casually started picking up the loot, the Watcher's theory was cemented. This guy was definitely the contractor for the secret tome. The whole thing was just unbelievable. How could a simple hunter in training possibly have a legendary item like the secret tome? The Watcher's mind started racing. For a rookie to have something this rare, it meant one thing: he had some incredibly powerful people backing him from the shadows. The Watcher's mind jumped to a conclusion. He thought Woojin must be part of some powerful shadowy group. He was so sure of it, but then something made him stop. He was completely caught off guard. Turns out Woojin had turned around and was staring right at him. From the Watcher's perspective, he looked like an absolute monster. Woojin's face was dark, his eyes practically glowing. He didn't say a word. The other guy immediately dropped the tough act. He raised his hands and his spear, trying to show he wasn't a threat. He explained that he was just on edge because the tower is so competitive, insisting he didn't want to fight. But inside, his mind was racing. He couldn't place him at all. This guy was clearly special, but he'd never seen him before. This was bad. An unknown person this strong could ruin everything he had planned. He decided he couldn't just let it go. He had to figure out why this stranger was so interested in collecting slime parts. He knew the tower had a rule against fighting other people, but he also knew rules like that were just for show. Instead of confronting the guy hiding in the shadows, Woojin just turned and started walking. The Watcher was confused. He expected a fight, not this. But then he realized Woojin wasn't walking away. He was walking straight towards him. The guy's mind started racing, trying to figure out what was about to happen. Woojin kept coming, his steps slow and steady. The Watcher tightened his grip on his spear, bracing for the worst. The Watcher was convinced this was it, that Woojin was one of his enemies. But then our boy just smiled, held out his hand, and introduced himself. The other guy was completely speechless. This was the last thing he ever expected. He just stood there with a calm, friendly smile, like this was a totally normal way to meet someone. The Watcher, completely caught off guard, stammered out his own name, Jo Seung-jun. He shook Woojin's hand, still trying to process what was happening. After the handshake, they just stood there for a second. The tension was gone, replaced by a slightly awkward silence. Seung-jun was the first to speak. He asked Woojin if he'd noticed something strange going on in the lab. He pointed out all the weapons scattered on the floor. He explained that slimes were dropping them everywhere, and he thought it was weird. He reminded Woojin that the whole point of hunting slimes in the tutorial tower was to get that kind of farming equipment. That's why he was so confused. He told Woojin about some weirdo he'd seen who was just taking out the slimes and leaving all the valuable weapons behind. Woojin just calmly admitted that he was the one who did it. Seung-jun was completely speechless. The guy confessed way too easily, and he had absolutely no idea what this dude's deal was. Seung-jun was still trying to wrap his head around this guy. He wondered if Woojin was one of those guys, but he immediately dismissed the idea. People like that were super secretive about who they were. They'd never be so obvious. So if Woojin wasn't with them, what in the world was his goal here? Shaking off his thoughts, Seung-jun put on a friendly face. He complimented Woojin, saying that climbing the tower must be a piece of cake for him. Then he announced he had to get going. Woojin just agreed, and they went their separate ways. As Seung-jun walked away, his mind went right back to it. He was pretty sure Woojin wasn't one of them. But the fact that he was collecting slime byproducts was a huge red flag, because those byproducts were connected to a hidden secret of the tutorial tower, something that wasn't supposed to be revealed for another 20 years. He stopped, a serious look on his face. He had a strong feeling that Woojin knew about that secret too. Seung-jun watched him go, a thought crossing his mind. Could Woojin also be? His mind flashed back to the past. He remembered the day the world was destroyed. Everything was gone, turned to dust and rubble. But just before the end, a miracle had been granted to him. That miracle was regression, the power to turn back time. He was sent back 30 years into the past. In his 30 years of reliving this life, he had never heard the name Woojin. If he wasn't one of those guys, then there was only one other possibility. Could Woojin have also received the miracle of regression just like him? He watched Woojin disappear into the tower, the question hanging heavy in his mind. Seung-jun shook his head, deciding he was just worrying for no reason. It was impossible. He had to focus on his own task. If he lost the hidden piece to someone else, all his plans to stop the world's destruction would completely fall apart. Meanwhile, Woojin was already inside, standing in a massive empty hall. He thought back to the guy he'd just met. He couldn't help but think he was a pretty funny one. He started to analyze the man's behavior. The guy had always kept his distance, except for the moment they shook hands. Even after seeing the spirit of the secret tome, he'd hidden his expression instantly. Woojin realized that despite how he looked, the man was actually pretty sly. Zhou Xiangjun, this guy was definitely interesting. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe, just maybe, that guy was a lot like him. With the slimes taken care of, the haul was finally clear. He had hunted enough of them to gather all the ingredients he needed. Quick check of his inventory showed he had plenty of slime cores and fluid. There were still some locked slots, but for now he had everything required for his recipe. He found a corner of the dungeon that was clean enough to work in. He turned to the spirit of the secret tome and told it he was ready to start cooking. The little spirit just stared at him, a loading icon spinning above its head. After a moment, it just said one word, pot. Woojin was completely confused, asking what it meant by that. Woojin sighed. He pointed out the obvious. He couldn't cook with his bare hands. He asked the spirit if there was some way to get tools inside the dungeon. The little spirit Tick suddenly freaked out. It looked like it had completely forgotten something important. It quickly told the chef he was right, then started casting a spell. A bright green light shot from its hand, forming a magic circle on the ground. A huge pot materialized out of the light. Tick proudly announced that it could summon any tools he needed anytime. So Woojin immediately put in a request for square mold and a silicone spatula. Without missing a beat, Tick summoned them right away. With a full set of tools and ingredients laid out, Woojin rolled up his sleeves. It was time to begin. He announced the name of the dish he was making, slime jelly. He held up the ingredients, explaining that a slime's fluid and its core were the best possible things to use for this recipe. He looked at the slime core. It had a different texture from the rest of the fluid, so he decided to prepare it separately. Turns out the inner parts didn't mix with the liquid, which gave him an idea. He could use them to create patterns. The core itself was chewy, so he chopped it up into tiny cubes, planning to use them like tapioca pearls. Next, he boiled the slime fluid. This was the most important step to get rid of its poisonous properties. Once it was safe, he poured the liquid into a mold to let it set. He waited just long enough for the edges to start firming up. Then, while the jelly was only partially solid, it was time for the next ingredient. Even Tick looked excited. He explained that the melted inner part he'd set aside earlier was the real key to the whole dish. He explained that cooling it too much would ruin the texture. The timing had to be perfect. So while it was still just slightly cooled, he poured the liquid into the mold over the cubes. Then he gently stirred the mixture, creating swirls inside the jelly. He explained that the patterns would give each bite a different taste and feel, so it wouldn't get boring. With the pattern set, it was time to cool it down. Instead of a fridge, he just used his own energy to instantly freeze it solid. A moment later, he flipped the mold over. The slime jelly was finally complete. And there it was. It looked like a giant glowing green emerald. Woojin looked pretty satisfied with his work. Tick was completely blown away. Tick was practically losing his mind, begging Woojin to cut the jelly already, but Woojin just told him to calm down. At the same time, a system window popped up. A new recipe had been recorded and its grade was about to be assessed. Both of them turned to face the blue screen, waiting for the result. The system began loading the information for Chef Chen Woojin's slime jelly. And the result came back slime jelly, grade F. Woojin's face went pale. He couldn't believe it. His cooking, F. Tick quickly tried to cheer him up, telling him to wait until the very end. He was right. The system window updated, showing that while the recipe was grade F, the quality was still being evaluated. Woojin seemed pretty down, asking if quality was really more important than the grade. Tick insisted that it absolutely was. And then a new notification popped up that changed everything. Level up. Suddenly, the system just exploded with notifications. Even though the recipe itself was only grade F, the quality was a shocking grade. Because of that, he unlocked a bunch of achievements and started leveling up over and over again. Tick couldn't believe it, and a grade quality was a massive deal. And the rewards just kept coming. The system announced that because of his achievements, he had unlocked new recipes. Tick was practically vibrating with excitement. He congratulated the chef, telling him that achieving a grade quality was truly amazing. Woojin still wasn't convinced. He pointed out that the recipe's grade was still a F, but Tick immediately insisted that didn't matter at all. Tick offered to explain why quality was so much more important than the grade. But he was so desperate to try the jelly, he asked if he could explain while he was eating. Woojin didn't care, so he just told him to go for it. Tick was absolutely thrilled. Without a moment's hesitation, Tick grabbed a huge piece of the jelly and started chowing down. The first bite completely blew Tick away. He shouted that it was unbelievably delicious, and that making a contract with the chef was the best decision of his entire life. Woojin listened quietly. After a moment, Tick remembered he was supposed to be explaining the system. He told Woojin that quality simply represents how tasty a dish is. He explained that a grade quality puts the dish in the realm of true gourmet dining. Tick compared it to fine dining or high-end omakase. That's when Woojin asked what the grade of a recipe meant if quality was all about taste. The little guy explained that the grade just shows how difficult a dish is to prepare. Since slime jelly is so simple, it's naturally rated low. He said that the higher the quality and grade, the more points you earn. But you can also get achievements with exceptional skill, just like Woojin did. Woojin finally took a bite himself. As he ate, Tick pointed out that adding the slime cores to improve the texture was a brilliant choice. Tick then excitedly reminded him that new recipes had also been unlocked. He congratulated the chef, explaining that the recipes are the real treasure of the dungeon chef's secret tome. Tick popped up, happily explaining that all these new recipes could be bought with points. The system showed Woojin's cooking level was already at 4. The list was full of slime-based dishes, each with a different price. The quest section, however, was still locked. Woojin just looked at the screen, calmly noting that the recipes were finally available to him. Tick seemed a little thrown off by how casual he was. But then he realized, of course our boy isn't impressed. He's been making up his own incredible recipes from the start. Woojin pointed out that even with all his points, he couldn't buy everything. Tick had to remind him that for a beginner, the amount of points he'd earned was actually huge. The little guy started explaining the normal way to do things. Usually, a chef would clear quests, unlock the easiest recipes first, and slowly work their way up. Woojin asked if that meant he hadn't followed the normal training method. Tick nervously agreed, pretty much confirming that our boy had skipped the entire tutorial. He looked back at the recipe list. After all, even for Master Chef, following a pre-made recipe was the easiest way to guarantee a good result and earn more points. Tick explained that making high-quality food was the key. It was the fastest way to raise his cooking level, which would unlock even better recipes. The little spirit was still in awe. He admitted that what Woojin had done, creating new high-quality recipes and reaching level 4 without any quests, was something that hadn't happened in thousands of years. Tick confirmed that Woojin could just keep making up his own dishes if he wanted to. Our boy seemed to be thinking about that. But Tick brought up a problem. Only official hunters could get quests from the secret tome. The little guy suggested that Woojin could just focus on becoming a hunter to unlock that part of the system. But Woojin wasn't interested. Dungeons were full of unknown ingredients, and he wasn't about to leave just to follow some rules. He decided he'd just try making some other dishes instead. Tick was totally on board with the plan. After all, he still had about 2 weeks before the tutorial tower closed. Plenty of time to experiment. He arrived on the second floor of the tutorial tower, and right away, spears shot out from the walls. Turns out, the second floor was a whole different game. The traps were much harder, and every slime had its own unique power, making them tricky to handle. Most people who got this far had to focus just on staying alive. But for Woojin, none of that was a problem, because while everyone else was fighting for their lives, he was busy with something else entirely. This guy always walked his own path. He calmly started bottling up his newest creation. The system registered his new dish, red slime jam. The recipe itself was only a D- grade, but the final product came out as a B. He even leveled up from it. Tick seemed impressed. She praised the jam for being a fantastic idea that broke the rule about jams being sweet. But despite her words, the experiment was still considered another failure. Tick was losing her mind. She couldn't understand what was wrong with the dish, arguing that it was perfect. After all, he'd been cooking nonstop for 10 days. She pointed out that his secret tome had leveled up 3 times, and he'd gained a ton of points. She started to worry that maybe she was the one who wasn't skilled enough to help him. But Woojin knew that wasn't it. He explained that the problem wasn't her skill, it was the ingredients. There was only so much he could do with what he had. He told her he'd spent 10 days searching the first and second floors of the tower. While the second floor had slimes with different attributes, the first only had basic green ones. And even though their tastes were a little different, it wasn't a big enough change. He had officially hit the limit of what was possible with just slimes. He looked up with a sigh of regret. If only he'd had a little bit of chocolate, he said, it would have been perfect. What a pity. Tick was quiet for a moment, just taking that in. Then she looked at him with total awe. She told him that he was, without a doubt, the most talented chef she had ever seen. Tick continued her explanation, telling him that even the best products need a solid foundation. She admitted that his passion for creating new dishes was an important quality for any chef. But then she got to the real issue. She told him that while he had brilliant talent, he knew nothing about dungeon cooking. She suggested that instead of trying to create something new from scratch, he should build his foundation by learning the recipes that already exist. Woojin considered her words for a moment. Building a foundation, a small smile formed on his lips. He told her she was right. Tick was so happy to hear him say that she was practically bouncing. With that settled, he decided to start from the beginning. He pulled up a list of recipes to check out. The system showed a whole menu of slime dishes, a de spaghetti sauce, even different kinds of lattes. But one recipe at the very bottom immediately caught his attention. King Slime Sherbet. The word king immediately caught his eye. This sounded interesting. Without hesitation, he selected it. The system confirmed the purchase and showed him the ingredients. He'd need the fluid and the core from a king slime. But then he paused. He hadn't seen any monster called a king slime around here. He started to wonder if he'd have to leave the tower to find one. Just then, the system updated. Turns out the ingredients dropped on the 3rd floor of this very tower. He smiled. He'd already found the exit to the next floor, so this was perfect. With a new plan in place, he told Tick it was time to go. She cheered, ready for the next challenge. His next goal was set. He was going to make King Slime Sherbet. Turns out, while Woojin was busy cooking slimes, 10 days had passed in the real world. Outside the tower entrance at Seoul City Hall, a huge crowd of reporters had gathered. The reason for all the excitement was simple. Today was the first time a climber was expected to clear the 3rd floor, and everyone was waiting to see who would come out. 2 guys in the crowd were talking about it. One figured the big guilds had already snatched up anyone good. The other was hoping an unknown talent might appear, which is why they were all there. As they wondered who would be the first one out, the gate began to glow. Someone was finally coming. A woman stepped through the portal. It was Beek Sialha, the daughter of the head of the Heavenly Wings Guild, the 2nd largest guild in the entire country. The second she appeared, the reporters swarmed her, cameras flashing from every direction. They immediately started shouting questions about her future and whether she'd join her father's guild. But she completely shut them down. She told them she doesn't do interviews that weren't scheduled in advance and ordered them to get out of her way. The 2 guys just watched her go. One of them sighed, muttering about how unfair it all was. The reporters kept shouting, but she ignored them completely. The crowd just watched her go, muttering about how some people are born with everything, looks, talent, and powerful parents. The blonde guy scoffed, wondering if a third-floor climber would even look at a mid-sized guild. His friend figured some might, especially the ones with a hero complex who want to build a guild from the ground up. The guy with the glasses was getting impatient. He complained that they had to wait there for 4 more days. According to him, all the promising climbers come out on day 10. Day 13 is the last real chance to find anyone useful. He finished by saying that anyone who comes out on the last 2 days is just a quitter or totally useless. He didn't even see the point in waiting around for them. But of course, they had no idea what was actually happening inside the tower. Woojin was making his way through the floors, effortlessly taking down any monster that stood in his way. He paused for a second, taking a look around. He realized the structure of the 3rd floor was completely different from the first 2. This place felt more like a proper dungeon. The first 2 floors had been confusing mazes, but this 3rd floor was different. It was a series of rooms connected to one another. He kept moving, taking in the new layout. That's when he spotted an entrance that looked totally different from the others. He wondered if it was some kind of special room. He walked towards it without hesitation. He stepped through the doorway and just stopped. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. There was an entire forest inside the tower. Tick was just as surprised, excitedly asking if they had somehow ended up outside. Woojin thought about her question as he looked at the plants around them. But this wasn't just a normal forest. There were slimes here too, but they were yellow and red, not the usual green. Woojin shook his head, telling her he didn't think they were outside. He pointed towards something deeper in the woods. In a clearing stood a massive stone monument. Tick immediately recognized it as a slime altar. As Woojin stared at the altar, a blue screen suddenly appeared right in front of his face. It was his special ingredient detection skill. The system told him the ingredients for King Slime Sherbet were here, but he'd need to spend 20 dungeon cooking points to unlock the special method required to get them. This was it, he was sure the King Slime was here. Without a second of hesitation, he pressed yes. He was actually a little impressed. The system had a lot more convenient features than he first thought. His eyes narrowed, he knew exactly what he had to do. Just as Woojin was getting started, someone else stumbled through a portal. The guy, Jo Seung-jun, looked completely wiped out, but he'd finally made it. He took a second to catch his breath, thinking it took way longer than expected. But then he looked up and froze. Was Chen Woojin? Seung-jun couldn't believe it. He was certain this meant Woojin was also after the hidden piece. Woojin just smiled and casually greeted him, acknowledging that he'd made it to the 3rd floor. Seung-jun laughed it off, saying the tutorial tower was a huge opportunity he couldn't miss. He even complimented Woojin, saying it was impressive that he'd made it this far too. Woojin just smirked and said he was here to get something specific too. And from the look on his face, he knew he was in the right place. That was all the confirmation Seung-jun needed. He was now absolutely sure they were both after the same thing, the hidden piece. He decided to play it cool. He told Woojin he was exhausted and needed to rest for a bit. But really, he was planning to keep a very close eye on him. Tick asked if he was going to summon the King Slime right away, but Woojin shook his head. He told her he needed more ingredients first and decided to go hunt some more slimes. From a distance, Seung-jun watched him go. He figured out Woojin's plan immediately. The system showed that to summon the King Slime, you needed 200 slime cores and 200 fluids, and to make things worse, the tower was set to close in just 4 days. This clown Seung-jun had a brilliant idea. He just let Woojin do all the hard work, then swoop in and take the boss for himself. Meanwhile, Woojin was just thinking about how busy he was going to be, needing ingredients for both the recipe and the summoning. It was now his 11th day in the tower, so Woojin got to work. He moved through the forest, taking down slime after slime with incredible speed. Tick just floated nearby, completely amazed by how cool he looked. He was gathering all sorts of materials, red slime cubes, green slime, and plenty of fluid. The ingredients were piling up fast. And the whole time, Seung-jun was hiding in the bushes, keeping a close eye on his every move. This went on for a while. By the 13th day, Woojin was still hunting and Seung-jun was still watching, waiting for his moment. Finally, after all that grinding, they stopped. Woojin and Tick stood at the base of a massive tree looking up. It seemed like they had finally found what they were looking for. It was now the 14th day since they entered the tower. And this whole time, Seung-jun just kept watching. He knew time was running out. The tower was going to close tomorrow. Woojin felt the pressure too. His chance to get the hidden piece was either today or he'd have to wait 3 months. Wasting that much time would completely ruin his plan. From his hiding spot, Seung-jun was certain. Chen Woojin had already gathered everything he needed to summon the boss. This clown figured Woojin was just being cautious, waiting because he knew someone was watching. But what really confused him was seeing Woojin eating what he thought was poisonous slime fluid. He started to wonder if that little spirit was the source of the power. An ability to eat any monster would be an incredible tool for survival in a dungeon. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. He needed to stop getting distracted and figure out how to take the boss without Woojin noticing. And that's when he realized he'd found a pattern. For the last 4 days, Woojin had been leaving this spot at regular 4-hour intervals. This was the opening he'd been waiting for. Seung-jun was getting frustrated. Woojin's schedule was completely random. It was a huge gamble, but he knew he had to wait for an opening. He estimated that at best, he'd have about 30 minutes once Woojin left. He stared at the altar, wondering if that was enough time to summon the boss, defeat it, and grab the hidden piece. He shook off the doubt. The longer he waited, the more his chance would slip away. He decided right then, the next time Woojin left, he was summoning the King Slime. He had all the ingredients ready. All he had to do was wait for Woojin to leave for his next slime hunt. And just like he predicted, Woojin headed off into the woods. This was it. This was his chance. The second Woojin was out of sight, Seung-jun burst from his hiding spot. He sprinted towards the altar, not wasting a single moment. He reached the stone platform and threw the ingredients onto it, beginning the summoning. He tossed all the ingredients onto the altar. The summoning began instantly. This was his one shot, and he was putting everything he had into it. A huge pillar of light erupted from the stone, shooting straight into the sky. He looked up with a smirk. Everything was going exactly as planned. And there it was. A massive dark slime with a tiny crown on its head appeared in the sky. The creature came crashing down with incredible force, shaking the entire area. The shockwave sent him flying. This guy clearly wasn't ready for this kind of power. The king slime rose up, its massive body blocking out the sun. The real fight was about to begin. King Slime slammed down with full force, hitting him dead on. Woojin stood there for a second, completely still. Tick called out to him, worried. But he was fine. Woojin drew his sword and told her he needed to get back to the altar. He gripped his spear and swung with everything he had. The weapon shot forward in a blur, aimed right at the King Slime's core. The attack hit dead center. The creature didn't even have time to react before the spear tore right through it. A grin spread across Woojin's face. It worked. He thought back, it had been half a year since he'd returned to the past. But he knew that just having knowledge of the future wasn't going to be enough. If things played out the same way they did before, this world was doomed. And right on cue, the King Slime's eyes started glowing red. It was furious. The monster unleashed a massive wave of dark energy, but Woojin was ready. He braced himself, knowing he'd planned for this exact moment. He couldn't afford a single mistake. The King Slime lunged forward, its massive body trying to crush him. He thought back to his training. He hadn't taken a single day off to prepare for this. The monster's slimy tentacles slammed down from every direction. He was caught right in the middle of the assault, trying to fend them off. The force of the blow was immense. It sent him flying backwards through the air. He hit the ground hard, but he was already pushing himself up. All that training had been for one purpose, to learn how to coat his weapon with mana. He poured every bit of mana he had into his spear, bracing against the slime's massive attack. The counter was perfect. He landed right on top of the creature and drove the spear straight through its body. This guy was getting cocky. He was convinced an attack like that could take down any boss. He jumped back, putting some distance between them. His focus was absolute, ready for whatever came next. He could feel it. He was way stronger now than he'd ever been. And with this new strength, he thought he might finally be able to get his hands on the hidden piece. But he celebrated too soon. The King Slime surged forward and swallowed him whole. Woojin showed up just in time to see the other guy fighting the King Slime. He hung back in the trees, watching everything unfold. And honestly, he was a little impressed. The guy was actually pretty good. He wasn't trying to block the slime's powerful attacks head-on. Instead, he was saving his strength by dodging and redirecting the bigger hits. It was a smart strategy. He ducked under another massive swing, staying just out of the monster's reach. The creature's attack was powerful, but it was also clumsy. Woojin realized this guy looked about the same age as him. But his fighting skills were on a completely different level, far beyond what you'd expect from someone so young. But as Woojin watched, he noticed something else. It wasn't just smart dodging. Woojin saw a faint energy coming from the blade of the spear. It was still weak, but there was no mistaking it. The hunter was using Spear Kai. For a modern hunter, that kind of skill was almost unheard of. Woojin was actually impressed. The guy's control of the spear was far better than his other skills. He even thought to himself that if this kid had been part of his old sect, he would have been pretty useful. But the little spirit Tick was getting tired of waiting. She flew up to Woojin, yelling that this was his chance to take down a king slime. Woojin just crossed his arms and told her no. He explained that stealing someone else's fight was just plain wrong. Tick didn't get it. Turns out Woojin had his own boss kill stolen once and he was furious about it. He wasn't about to do that to someone else. The memory was still fresh in his mind. He remembered a friend complaining about some jerks who stole all the credit for his hard work. His friend asked if he was cooking, and Woojin just told him not to get his hopes up. He remembered the scumbags who did it. That's why Woojin had a strict code. He explained to Tick that it's just basic manners to stay away from someone else's boss fight. The only exception would be if the hunter Xianjun was about to be taken out. Tick finally understood his reasoning. Meanwhile, the fight was getting intense. Xianjun dodged a massive attack from the King Slime, weaving through the chaos. He managed to land a solid hit right on the creature's body. Xianjun landed, steadying himself. He knew he'd trained for this, but he had to admit, taking this thing down alone was proving to be incredibly difficult. He was sweating hard, his energy fading. He was running out of mana. But he wasn't done yet. With his options disappearing, he steeled his resolve for one last push. He knew this was his last chance. He had to make it count. He gripped his spear, ready to face the attack head-on. He poured all his remaining energy into a single thrust, aiming for the core. He just had to pierce through. The resistance was immense, but he kept pushing forward. And there it was, right in the center, the hidden piece. That was the whole reason he was here. But the monster wasn't going down that easily. The force of the impact sent him flying backwards. He hit the ground hard, but as he looked up, something was wrong. He was completely confused. He couldn't believe it. Chen Woojin was already back. His perfect window of opportunity had just slammed shut. Chen Woojin just stood there, sword in hand, looking completely calm. Xianjun's eyes went wide. He just couldn't believe it. And then it hit him. This whole time, for 4 straight days, Woojin had been fooling him. But he didn't have time to think about that. The King Slime was crushing him. He grunted in pain, the pressure becoming too much to bear. That's when Woojin finally made his move. In a single blinding flash, he swung his sword. The attack tore straight through the trees, heading right for the monster. Xianjun was on the ground, completely defeated. He was furious with himself, realizing he'd missed his one perfect chance to attack because Woojin had distracted him. His spear was useless on the ground beside him. He knew his wounds were too deep, there was no way he could get back up and fight. All the fight just drained out of him. He slumped over, admitting to himself that this was his limit. Blood dripped down his face. This feeling was horribly familiar. He remembered failing just like this once before. His mind flashed back to a ruined city with rain pouring down on the rubble. He had come back to the past to prevent this, but he'd been a fool to think he could actually change the future. The memory was sharp and painful. He was holding someone he cared for as she died in his arms, right in the middle of all that destruction. But as he remembered that moment, something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let it end like this again, not this time. He slammed his hand on the ground, refusing to accept this ending. He told himself it didn't matter if he was foolish or if he'd failed before. Thinking like that would just lead to the same future. He remembered the intense regret he felt when the world had already fallen. He remembered how much he wished he had tried harder back then. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. If his wounds were too deep to fight, then he'd just have to burn his own life force. A powerful blue energy erupted from his body. He let out a roar, absolutely refusing to give up like this. He knew this was it. If he lost here, he'd never be able to change the future. He poured every last bit of his life force into his spear, screaming that he would defeat this thing no matter the cost. In an instant, he launched himself forward. The king slime didn't even have time to react. His spear slammed directly into the monster's core. He unleashed his skill, quantum, and a huge wave of energy exploded outwards. The backlash from the attack hit him hard. Blood dripped from his face. He could barely stand. His stamina was completely gone. The energy from his spear tore through the king's slime. This was it, the end. The monster's body began to dissolve. The force of the blast sent Xianho flying backward. The creature was being completely torn to shreds, unable to fight back at all. In a flash of light, the monster was gone, and in its place, a single glowing cube appeared. Xianho could only stare up from the ground, completely stunned. He struggled to push himself up, his body screaming in pain. He couldn't understand what he was seeing. He looked around, trying to figure out what just happened. He reached out, but there was nothing left but fading smoke. The fight was over. The dust settled, everything was quiet. Wujin stood there completely unfazed. He looked down at what was left of the king slime, and there lying on the ground was Zhou Xinjun. He was out cold, taken down by the sheer force of the attack. Wujin just stared at the message, taking it all in. And then the rewards appeared. A king slime core and a bottle of king slime fluid. For a chef like Wujin, these were some top-tier ingredients. His little spirit was going crazy. She couldn't believe he took down the boss in a single hit, cheering about how strong her chef was. But Wujin wasn't celebrating. He looked over at the unconscious hunter, thinking what a shame it all was. Wujin pieced it together. The moment this guy saw him arrive, his concentration completely broke. Then after taking a big hit, the hunter got impatient and made a stupid move. On top of that, he tried to force his energy while he was already hurt. His body was a complete mess. The thing is, even in that state, he could have easily gotten away. Wujin looked down at the reward in his hand. It all made sense. The hunter was after the king slime core. He walked over to the unconscious hunter. He wasn't sure if the guy could even hear him, but he spoke anyway. He made it clear that if he hadn't stepped in, Xinjun wouldn't have survived that last attack. So with a little smirk, he decided he'd be taking the core as payment for saving his life. He told the hunter it was a fair trade, the core in exchange for his life. With that settled, he decided he'd just take a small piece as payment for saving the hunter's life. Now that the business was done, his chef instincts kicked in. He was curious what this king slime actually tasted like. Without any hesitation, he scooped up a bit and tasted it. His little spirit looked on, super excited. The flavor hit him instantly. It was completely unexpected. He realized it was incredibly sweet and soft, not at all like its strong smell. The taste was a lot like durian, though it did leave a strange aftertaste. A smile spread across his face. Of course, a boss monster would have an ingredient this good. That's when the inspiration hit. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to make something with this right now. He immediately started looking for recipes and found one for something called quantum shams sherbet. For a dish made from a king slime, he was surprised that the recipe seemed so ordinary. He looked at the recipe a little confused. It seemed way too simple for a boss monster ingredient. He wondered if maybe a part of it was missing. But his little spirit completely lost it. She popped up and insisted that the recipes were perfect and had no mistakes. Wujin was a bit taken aback by her outburst. She scolded him for even doubting it. He quickly agreed to just follow the instructions exactly as they were written. The recipe was straightforward. First, he had to boil the body fluids to make them sweeter. Then he needed to grind the frozen core into a fine powder. For the second step, our boy didn't need a grinder. He just used one of his skills, the black orb vacuum, creating a sphere of dark energy around the core. With just a gesture of his hand, he controlled the flow of energy, wrapping it tightly around the crystal. The pressure inside the orb was immense. The solid core immediately started to crack and break apart. In seconds, it was completely crushed into a fine, shimmering powder. He could tell the technique was working perfectly. He held the orb of destructive energy in his hand. He had to admit, this was definitely not what he created this martial art for. Back in his old world, countless people had been eliminated by this very technique. It felt like a strange kind of pity. With that thought pushed aside, he moved on to the next step. He poured the finely ground core powder into the slime fluids. As he started to stir, he was amazed. The moment the powder hit the liquid, the whole thing got noticeably thicker. He realized the recipe wasn't just for this one monster. This trick would probably work on any kind of slime. It was completely different from before. When he just melted the core and mixed it in, the texture wasn't anything like this. It was a huge breakthrough for him. He understood that the cooking method could completely change how an ingredient works. He couldn't help but smile. This was actually fun. With a look of pride, he declared the king slime sherbet was finally done. It looked incredible, a perfect scoop of rainbow-colored sherbet sparkling in a glass. The system immediately recognized it. It was a unique dish called king slime sherbet, apparently created by some legendary dungeon chef. His perfect cooking method had actually purified the monster's energy, and just for making it, he earned a bunch of experience. Then a whole flood of messages popped up, achievements for amazing quality and high rarity. He even leveled up and got 25 dungeon cooking points. This was a much bigger deal than he expected. Woojin just stood there, taking it all in with a quiet, satisfied smile. He figured it was time to taste his creation. His little spirit was practically vibrating with excitement, screaming for him to give her a bite. But just as she was about to dig in, Woojin paused. Something felt off. Miles away, Seung-jun was slumped against a tree. The poor guy was completely defeated, both physically and mentally. Seung-jun slowly started to come to. He looked up, trying to figure out how long he'd been out. Woojin watched him, noticing that the hunter's mana hadn't recovered much. Still, he was surprised the guy had woken up so soon. Seung-jun gritted his teeth. His whole body felt like it was on fire. He figured he had some broken ribs, but he could still move if he had to. That's when Seung-jun called out his name. Woojin's spirit immediately panicked, asking if he was seriously thinking about sharing the sherbet with this guy. Woojin just stood there completely silent. The memory came flooding back to Seung-jun. He remembered seeing Woojin take down the king slime right before he passed out. He recalled Woojin's calm, focused expression as he unleashed that final attack. And he remembered seeing the item in Woojin's hands. To him, it could only be one thing, the hidden piece. Woojin held the glass, completely unaware of what the other hunter was thinking. But somewhere else, another hunter was absolutely losing his mind. He couldn't believe how careless he'd been. The hidden piece from the tutorial tower was now in Woojin's hands. It was over. The thing is, once a hidden piece appears, it never shows up again. All of his plans were completely ruined. He was so close to getting it himself, but now it was all gone. Seung-jun sat there absolutely furious with himself. He'd planned everything, even distracting Woojin with other slimes. But in the end, he was left with nothing. He tried to calm himself down, thinking it wasn't completely over yet. A dangerous look crossed his face. He knew Woojin wouldn't just share the reward. Honestly, he wouldn't have either. If he wanted it back, he'd have to take it by force. His hand dug into the dirt. He was done thinking. He steeled himself, ready to do whatever it took to get that hidden piece back. He got to his feet, fully prepared for a fight. And that's when a voice cut through his anger, casually asking if he wanted to try some. Seung-jun looked up. There was Woojin holding out a bowl of sherbet. The very thing he was about to fight to the death for had been turned into a snack. Seung-jun was completely thrown off. He was ready for a fight, not a snack. But Woojin just stood there, looking at him with a perfectly calm expression. The offer was so bizarre that Seung-jun couldn't even form a proper sentence. Woojin just told him to have some, saying he must be exhausted after the fight. He hesitantly took the spoon, completely confused. He couldn't understand why this guy would just share the reward. But after a moment, he decided to stop thinking about it. This was his chance. He scooped up a spoonful of the colorful dessert. Even as he brought it to his lips, he was still trying to figure out what Woojin's angle was. He figured it was probably fine. After all, you couldn't actually get taken out in this place, so he took a bite. The second it hit his tongue, his entire world lit up. It was like a bolt of lightning shot straight through his brain. Woojin's little spirit, however, was flying around, cheering about how amazing her chef's food was. But when Woojin tried it himself, his face twisted in disgust. He couldn't believe how awful it was. Seung-jun, on the other hand, was having a completely different experience. The taste was so sweet it actually hurt his throat, and there was a strange aftertaste he just couldn't place. He seriously wondered if this guy had mixed his dirty laundry into the bowl. He couldn't understand how this could possibly be considered food. Woojin slapped a hand to his forehead, completely defeated. He figured the spirit wasn't human, so maybe her taste buds were just weird. But then he looked over at Seung-jun. That guy was human, so how in the world was he eating this stuff? Seung-jun stared at the spoonful of sherbet. He told himself that since this was a hidden reward, he had to be able to handle something like this. He decided he had to eat it for the sake of his future. It was a noble sacrifice. He forced it down, trying his best to just get through the horrible taste. But a moment later, he shot up, completely stunned. Something was happening. A system window popped up right in front of him. It said that by eating the king slime sherbet, he had absorbed its pure energy. His mana had just increased by 5. Seung-jun couldn't believe it. He'd never heard of a hidden item that could increase your stats just by eating it. He wondered if this was the power of Woojin's secret cooking method. Meanwhile, Woojin's little spirit was crying tears of joy, shoveling down a giant bowl of the sherbet. To her, it was the most delicious thing in the world. Woojin looked down at Seung-jun, who was still sitting on the ground trying to process everything. He cleared his throat, getting the guy's attention. Woojin watched him for a moment and then asked how it tasted. Seung-jun panicked a little, trying to figure out what to say. He assumed it must be bad since it was made from a monster, but he felt really thankful to Woojin for even trying. To his own surprise, Seung-jun blurted out that it was actually really delicious. Woojin just smirked, asking if he really meant that. The hunter nodded enthusiastically. He then quickly added a thank you for saving his life back in the dungeon. But as he was talking, a bright light suddenly shone down on him from above. He looked around, completely confused by what was happening. Then his eyes shot open. He recognized this feeling, he was sure of it. Powerful energy was surging through his entire body. The sherbet was doing a lot more than just increasing his stats. But then a terrifying thought hit Jun. He had to get out of there right now. Because if he stayed, this chef might make him eat other, even weirder things. Woojin just watched him, a thoughtful look on his face. So Jun quickly bowed, thanking Woojin again for saving him and for the food. Our boy happily offered to make him something else, but Jun practically shouted his refusal. The poor guy insisted he didn't want to be a bother anymore and then just took off running. Woojin watched him disappear, thinking it was a real shame. His little spirit popped up, saying that Jun must be a good person since he recognized how great Woojin's cooking was. Woojin seemed to agree, thinking to himself that they'd probably meet again someday. With Jun gone, Woojin turned to his spirit. He figured since tomorrow was their last day here, they might as well go gather some more ingredients. His little spirit was all for it, cheering him on. So with his blade in hand, Woojin was ready to get started. The system announced that there were only 2 hours left until the tutorial tower closed. Time was up. Without hesitation, he reached out and stepped through the portal. He emerged on the other side, back in the real world. His feet touched solid ground, leaving the tower behind for good. His little spirit tit popped out, overjoyed to finally be in the fresh air. Just then, a huge system window appeared. It congratulated him on clearing the tutorial tower, officially making him a hunter. For clearing the 3rd floor, he was rewarded with an inventory. The system also unlocked a new daily quest for him, dungeon cooking. A status window and an inventory. Those were game changers for any hunter. But for a cook with his kind of ambition, they were the perfect tools to get started. But as Woojin was processing his new rewards, he suddenly snatched his little spirit tit out of an insane amount of pressure exploded from him, his energy taking the form of a terrifying demonic beast. He held the squirming spirit forward, his entire presence screaming danger. With a cold look in his eyes, he demanded to know what was going on. Turns out a tiny system guide had appeared. The poor thing was sweating bullets, begging the chef to please calm down. The system window just kept going, asking if he wanted to learn how to use his new status window and inventory. Our boy just thought to himself, wondering what would happen if he said no. The little guide quickly tried to explain that they were just there to provide guidance, repeating the offer for a tutorial. After all that intimidation, Woojin just looked down, a little bit of drool escaping his mouth, and casually agreed. The little system guide turned into a stream of golden light and flew straight into Woojin's chest. He didn't even flinch. He just calmly noted that it was entering his body, finding the whole thing pretty interesting. A voice inside his head explained that both the status window and the inventory could be opened with just a thought. Our boy immediately understood how useful those 2 things would be for him. Right on cue, a new window appeared. It was his first daily quest. The quest had 2 parts, cook in a dungeon and serve his food to someone else. He thought it was a pretty simple quest, honestly. Cooking was no big deal, he did that all the time. The real challenge was finding someone else to feed. Then he had an idea. If he couldn't find a stranger, he figured he could always just feed his friend Xianho. Just then, a loud voice called out his name. The guy sounded pretty annoyed, asking why Woojin had gone in without him. Turns out it was his friend Xianho walking straight towards them. Woojin was completely caught off guard and asked him what he was even doing. Xianho just grinned and put his hands on Woojin's shoulders. He explained that he was there to help now that Woojin had cleared the 3rd floor. He told him there was no time to waste. The determined look, he told Woojin it was time to go. And just like that, Xianho led the way. They walked for a bit until they finally arrived. Xianho stopped and yelled out that they were here, calling for someone named Chef. Tit looked up, her eyes wide with amazement. They had arrived at the Hunter Academy. The massive building was bustling with people. The sight brought back a memory for Woojin. He remembered Xianho begging him to join, admitting that he'd barely even cleared the 1st floor of the tower himself. And now, here in the present, Xianho was still at it. He followed Woojin up the stairs, refusing to believe that he was really that weak. He told Woojin it didn't matter anyway. He could nominate him for his own guild, and if Woojin passed the exam, they could be teammates. Our boy just looked completely bored by the whole conversation. Woojin just shut him down with a single word, negative. Xianho was stunned, then furious. This dude completely lost it, screaming about all the amazing benefits Woojin was throwing away. A custom schedule, great welfare, even free gear. He just couldn't understand why anyone would refuse. Woojin calmly explained that all those amazing benefits were exactly why he didn't want to join. Xianho just slapped a hand to his face, completely frustrated. He then laid out his real goal. He wanted to become a hunter so he could reach a higher level as a cook. Xianho was completely stunned. He thought Woojin was giving up cooking to become a fighter, not the other way around. Woojin just smiled and asked why on earth he would ever do that. He started walking off, leaving Xianho standing there totally lost. Xianho let out a sigh and warned him that he was making a huge mistake and was definitely going to regret it. That finally got Woojin's attention. Xianho explained that if he doesn't join a guild within a week of clearing the tower, there are consequences. Turns out, the government will force him to enroll in the Hunter Academy. Woojin seemed confused by the name. Xianho looked dead serious and confirmed it. Yes, the Hunter Academy. Xianho explained that if Woojin didn't join a guild, he'd be forced into the government-run Hunter Academy. He warned that since it's basically a military school, the treatment is awful. And once you're in, it's almost impossible to transfer out to a private guild. On top of that, the education system is completely out of date. Basically, you're trapped and can't do anything else with your time. Xianho continued, saying that while Academy hunters can enter any dungeon with an observer, it's a lot more dangerous than it sounds. But that was the one thing that caught Woojin's attention. He smiled, asking if he could really enter any dungeon. After hearing that, he just told Seonho he'd think about it. He then cut the conversation short, saying he was a little tired. Seonho just sighed, admitting he was tired too. He knew he wasn't getting through to him. Seonho shouted after him, warning him not to wait until the last day to make his decision. Woojin just calmly agreed, saying he'd have an answer by then. He had 1 week to decide his future. As he was thinking, a message popped up on his phone. It was from the Hunter Academy. The text officially announced that as an unaffiliated hunter, he had passed their screening and was expected to report for the entrance ceremony. The message ended with a serious warning. If he didn't register, he wouldn't be allowed to enter dungeons and would be kicked out of the program entirely. He knew he had to choose carefully, but his mind was already somewhere else. He was thinking about all the incredible ingredients he could use now that he was out of the tower, where all he had to work with was slime. Thanks to that, he'd been having the time of his life in the kitchen. He'd spent the entire week creating new recipes and it had paid off. He'd already leveled up twice. However, there was a catch. His daily quest showed that while he'd completed the cooking part, he hadn't finished the second objective, serving his food to someone else. He had failed the quest. Woojin had tried to offer his food to a guy at the gym, but this clown just laughed it off. He claimed it wasn't good for his body and that he couldn't eat anything outside of his strict diet. The guy tried to play it off, saying he was sure the food was great, but Woojin saw right through it. This scumbag was a coward. His little spirit looked up at him, worried. She asked if he was still going to cook even if he went to the academy, reminding him that he had promised. Woojin told her of course he would. He explained that becoming a better cook was the whole reason he became a hunter in the first place. Just then, his phone started ringing. It was Seonho. Over the phone, Seonho's voice came through, saying he guessed Woojin had made his decision to enlist. Woojin just stared at the screen for a moment. He was clearly pissed off, but his mind was made up. He told Seonho he was going, and with that, he headed straight for the Hunter Academy. They arrived at the main gymnasium, which was already packed with other recruits. This was it. Woojin and his spirit looked around the academy. The place was buzzing with energy. His little spirit floated beside him, pointing out that something felt a bit off. The place was filled with all sorts of people. Some guys were so excited they could barely contain themselves. Others were already filled with regret, second-guessing every choice that led them here. Woojin just took it all in. His spirit commented on the mix of people and how surprisingly clean the place was for an old school. He scanned the large gymnasium, getting a feel for the place. That's when the whispers started. The other recruits were all talking about someone in the crowd, a girl who had apparently cleared the 3rd floor. They were talking about a woman named Beexialha. Apparently, she was a big deal, and no one could figure out why she was at the academy instead of joining a top-tier guild. And there she was, Beexialha, the girl everyone was whispering about. Honestly, she didn't seem to care about the attention at all. But Woojin wasn't looking at her. His eyes were on someone else. It was Jo Seung-jun, the hunter he'd saved. He was surprised to see the guy here. And there he was, standing with his arms crossed, looking way more put together than the last time they met. Just then, the entrance ceremony started. Someone walked up to the front of the room. Woojin's little spirit popped up, absolutely losing it. She started whispering to Woojin that the man's head looked like a giant griffin egg, or maybe even takoyaki with flakes on top. She was laughing her head off. Woojin just looked on, completely unamused. The man on stage cleared his throat, and the sound echoed through the entire gym, silencing everyone. He looked out over the new recruits and announced that he was the principal of the Hunter Academy. The principal introduced himself as Lee Chin. The moment he said the name, Woojin's head snapped up. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Even Beexialha looked surprised. The principal continued, complaining about how the Hunter Academy's reputation was getting worse and worse. But for Woojin, it was more than that. The tone of his voice, the energy, it was all too familiar. There was no way. The principal's voice boomed that he couldn't help but feel sad about it all. And that's when it clicked for Woojin. Suddenly, a memory flooded his mind. He remembered one of his most loyal henchmen. The man had been one of the 3 great elders of the demonic cult. He was a pillar of Woojin's old life. Back in the present, the principal was still shouting, completely fired up. He claimed the biggest problem was the terrible attitude of the students who were entering his academy. Woojin's mind raced. He finally recognized him. The principal wasn't just some random guy. He was the Blood Demon, another one of his most powerful followers from the demonic cult. The memory was vivid. The Blood Demon had been a terrifying and absolutely loyal warrior. And now here he was standing right in front of him, the same man just living a new life. The chances of this happening were insane. Woojin remembered him clearly. The man was an absolute monster on the battlefield. The name finally clicked into place. It was Gyeokyeon, the Blood Demon. So Elder Gyo had made it to this world too. Woojin remembered the man's unwavering loyalty and the bravery he showed while serving him for so long. Meanwhile, the principal was still going on. The other students were getting restless, whispering about how long the speech was taking. The man was completely fired up, yelling about how today's hunters couldn't compare to the old generation. He claimed that back in his day, they didn't even need protective gear. But Woojin wasn't bored at all. He just smiled, thinking that his old subordinate must have found happiness in this new world. He silently wished him well, but he didn't realize that his strange, sentimental expression had caught someone's attention. A guy in the crowd watched him from a distance, a thoughtful look on his face. He clearly found Woojin's reaction to the principal's speech weird. The guy in the crowd kept staring. He could feel the principal's energy, but it was the man's intense passion that seemed out of place. He couldn't remember him being like this at all. The watcher's mind went back to the principal's history. This was a guy who had defeated B-class monsters in his prime. He didn't just fight them. He completely dominated the battlefield, leaving nothing but monster corpses behind. On top of that, he was even involved in a major Class Gate incident. The Watcher had done his research. He'd seen the old news articles. The public used to see him as a hero. So the real question was, why would a hunter with that kind of power be working as the principal of a military academy? Meanwhile, the principal was still yelling, telling the new students that relying on items was just plain stupid. But the Watcher's mind had already moved on. He was focused on something else now. There was a weird energy in this academy. And he was sure of one thing. A man with the principal's power and history would definitely know all about it. He needed to find out exactly what his return to this world had changed. That was the entire reason he'd come to the academy in the first place. And now it was finally beginning. Woojin stood among the other students, his expression completely serious, ready for whatever came next. He was focused on one thing, figuring out what was different. Just then, an instructor's voice cut through the silence, laying out the first test. The instructions were simple. He told them to attack the training dummy with everything they had. The score would appear after each strike, and they had to hit it 5 times to get an average. The man running the test was the vice principal, Choi Min-sung. He'd already hit the dummy himself, scoring a massive 30,766. Min-sung explained that this was just a simple test to figure out everyone's level. The students started whispering, wondering if a score that high was normal for the vice principal. Min-sung then told anyone using weapons to grab one from the side and asked if there were any questions. Immediately, a hand shot up. A student asked why they had to hit the dummy 5 times when just one hit should be enough. She waited for his answer, looking serious. The vice principal explained it was to test their endurance, to see how long they could maintain their maximum power. But the girl wasn't done. She asked him directly just how impressive his score really was. Min-sung paused for a second, then answered plainly. He told them he was a high B-class hunter. He told them that his B-class rank should give them a good idea of what to aim for. With no more questions, he announced it was time to move on. He then called for the students to come up in order. The first student stepped up and hit the dummy, scoring a measly 302. Another student followed, throwing a punch with everything he had. His score was a little better, just barely breaking 400. The poor guy couldn't believe it. He started complaining that the machine must be broken. Woojin watched with his arms crossed, completely unimpressed. He could see a few people who looked strong, but their skills were a joke. In a real fight, none of them would last 3 minutes. Suddenly, Woojin's little spirit perked up. She spotted someone she recognized, trying to remember his name. Just then, the announcer called out the next name, Jo Seung-jun. It was the hunter Woojin had saved. Woojin watched him walk up, remembering their last encounter. He remembered that back then, the guy was so worried about protecting him that he couldn't use his full power. But now, with nothing holding him back, Woojin was curious to see what he could really do. Based on the strength he'd shown at the gate, Woojin figured he should easily score at least 19,000. Jo Seung-jun took his stance and threw a punch with everything he had. The punch landed with a huge bang, shaking the entire room. The screen lit up with his score, 3,097. Woojin couldn't believe it. That couldn't be right. He knew for a fact the guy was way more powerful than that back at the gate. It was obvious he was hiding his true strength on purpose. The crowd started whispering. Sure, it was a high score compared to everyone else's, but it still felt off. They couldn't understand it. Why would someone that strong even be at the academy? They figured he must have a reason for holding back. While some poor guy was moping about his score of 153, the announcer called out the next name. Baek-seolha. She stepped forward, gripping her wooden sword. All eyes were on her. The crowd wondered how many points she would get. After all, Jo Seung-jun had scored over 3,000. She took a deep breath, centering herself. Then she raised the wooden sword. A powerful blue aura immediately started swirling around her. She swung down with everything she had. The sword slammed into the machine with incredible force. It was a clean, powerful hit. Everyone in the crowd was completely stunned. Their jaws dropped. Even Woojin was taken aback. He watched her, a bead of sweat running down his face. This was real power. The numbers on the screen kept climbing until they stopped. 10,000, a perfect score. Baek-seolha just stood there, completely unfazed, like it was nothing. Everyone else, though, was losing their minds. They couldn't believe a rookie had just shattered the high score. A talent like that should be in a top-tier guild, not here. Then it was Woojin's turn. While everyone was still buzzing about Baek-seolha, he just walked up and gave the machine a light tap. The score came back 222, pathetic by comparison. But our boy looked pleased. He figured a score that low wouldn't draw any attention. He could finally blend in. With the tests over, the new students got a tour of the campus and a rundown of the academy's rules. Their new life as cadets had officially begun. The cadets were taken to their new home, the Hunter Academy dormitory. Turns out Woojin was enjoying dorm life. He had a lot of freedom, and for him that meant one thing. He could finally cook whatever he wanted. He was especially excited about the blue slime salad he was making. Of course, people had tried to talk him out of staying. They warned him he should join a big guild instead. But Woojin wasn't interested in all that trouble. Here he was in a position to cook and serve whatever he wanted. The only problem, so far nobody had been brave enough to actually eat his food. Still, the academy was the perfect place to learn the basics. He was studying monster cookbooks, learning everything he could about dungeon ingredients. He knew that while you could find information anywhere, advice from an experienced teacher was priceless. The day had finally arrived. Woojin was ready for whatever the academy was about to throw at him. He knew he couldn't afford to be late. All the cadets were told to gather at the Hunter Academy's main gymnasium. The whole place was buzzing with nervous energy. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. An instructor stepped forward to address them. He sarcastically welcomed the new cadets, pointing out how thrilled they all looked. Then he got straight to the point. It was time for their first official assignment. He explained that he would be announcing the teams for a dungeon exploration. But there was a catch. The cadets would be paired up with active hunters who would be observing their every move. The news sent a wave of shock through the crowd. The instructor laid out their first assignment. They would be exploring a low-level dungeon. Jo Seung-joon listened intently as the instructor prepared to call out the team pairings. Woojin's little spirit popped up, excited about the dungeon exploration. To be fair, Woojin thought it sounded interesting too. With that, the instructor turned and began reading the names, pairing up the cadets one by one. After a few more pairs, the instructor finally looked up. He announced it was time to call the last team. The first name he called was Chen Woojin, and his partner was Baek Seolha. The announcement hung in the air. Everyone in the room turned to look at Baek Seolha, the academy's superstar. Woojin glanced over at his new partner, his expression completely unreadable. She met his gaze with an icy stare. It was pretty clear she wasn't happy about the pairing. Woojin didn't even flinch, he just stared back completely unbothered. But the instructor wasn't done. He announced their team's observer would be Hunter Kim Chiguk. That name got everyone talking. Kim Chiguk was a famous hunter from the Ju clan, so their team had two superstars. And Chen Woojin, a guy nobody had ever heard of. Woojin's little spirit whispered that this famous hunter was no match for him anyway. With that, the instructor finished the announcements and told everyone to go meet their teams. He explained that most of the observers were hunters already employed by the academy, but some had been invited from outside. Right on cue, the doors at the back of the gymnasium swung open. A group of professional hunters walked in. The instructor gave his final order: explore the dungeons safely under their guidance. He then dismissed the cadets to find their teams. The cadets started whispering excitedly among themselves. They couldn't believe the real Kim Chiguk was actually there. And there he was, Kim Chiguk. He gave a little wave, looking pretty pleased with all the attention he was getting. He walked right up to Woojin and Seolha's team. He introduced himself and asked if he could speak to them casually like they were old friends. His smile was directed right at Baek Seolha. He made it clear he knew exactly who she was and her connection to the Heavenly Wings Guild. Seolha immediately knew what this was about. This guy was trying to use this opportunity to make her guild owe him a favor. So Kim Chiguk started laying it on thick. He told her he'd turned down the academy's offer to be a guest lecturer multiple times. But when he heard she would be here, he just had to agree. He framed it as a big favor, a sign of goodwill between her guild and his Ju clan. Then this clown had the nerve to say that learning from a B-rank hunter like him would be a huge benefit for her. Seolha was not having it. You could see the annoyance flash in her eyes. She cut him off right there. She told him that at this moment she wasn't the daughter of the Heavenly Wings Guildmaster. She was just a cadet at the academy like everyone else. After getting shut down so hard, Kim Chiguk just laughed nervously. He quickly backed off, promising to be more careful with his words from now on. Woojin's little spirit was not impressed. She complained that the guy was annoying and seemed to be looking down on her master. But Woojin wasn't paying attention to any of that. He cut right through the awkwardness and said it was time to decide which dungeon they were going to. Seizing the chance to take charge again, Chiguk announced that he'd already looked at the list. According to him, there was only one dungeon suitable for their training. He held up his phone showing them his pick. Seolha's eyes went wide. She couldn't believe that's where he wanted to go. With a serious look, Chiguk announced their destination, the Killer Bee Dungeon. And with that, they headed out. They arrived at Namguro Station, the entrance to the Killer Bee Dungeon. Once you step through the portal, the place looks beautiful, almost like a park. But the truth is, this is a F-rank dungeon that most hunters stay away from. And there's a very good reason for that. The monster of this dungeon is the Killer Bee. And for a F-rank creature, they're surprisingly tough to handle. Seolha was starting to get worried. She wondered if this dungeon was too dangerous for Woojin, especially since his test scores were so bad. She watched. Woojin just calmly drew his sword. To be fair, she had to admit it was a pretty decent weapon. Seolha turned to Woojin, still looking worried. She told him the Killer Bee dungeon was pretty dangerous and asked if he wanted to talk it over with their instructor, Kim Chiguk. But before Woojin could even answer, someone else cut in. It was their instructor, Kim Chiguk. This guy just laughed it off, boasting that since he was a B-rank hunter, nothing could possibly go wrong. Then he tried to refer to Woojin and couldn't even remember his name. As Chiguk casually put his arm around Woojin, Seolha jumped in. She reminded the instructor of Woojin's name and pointed out that it was disrespectful to underestimate a top scorer from the academy. She added that Woojin should be able to take care of himself. Woojin just gave a slow nod, looking completely bored with the whole conversation. That's when Chiguk decided to explain why he picked this place. Turns out, other guilds were sending all their new recruits to the easier low-level dungeons, and they were getting way too crowded. He said that in those other places, the monsters get wiped out so fast that there's nothing left for proper training. Plus, they were so easy that Seolha would have handled everything alone, and he wouldn't get a chance to show his own skills. He finished with a confident smile, telling them he wanted everyone to gain as much as possible from this training. Chiguk kept trying to sell them on the idea, saying they'd be fine unless a C-rank boss showed up. But Seolha's face said it all, she wasn't buying it. Then he played his trump card, explaining that the Killer Bee dungeon doesn't even have a boss monster. With a smug look, he asked if anyone had any objections. Before they could answer, he told them it was time to go in. Seolha still looked worried, but she reluctantly agreed. Woojin's little spirit, on the other hand, was furious, complaining about how annoying their instructor was. Our boy just watched, keeping his thoughts to himself. With that settled, the team stepped into the Killer Bee dungeon. Once they were inside, Chiguk immediately started lecturing them about insect-type monsters. Just then, a few giant killer bees appeared. The instructor calmly pointed out that all insect types share the same common weaknesses. He then asked them condescendingly if they remembered any of this from their academy lectures. The instructor, Kim Chiguk, looked down at them with a smug expression. He started his lecture by explaining the most important thing about insect-type monsters. Without warning, he launched himself into the air, moving to demonstrate his point. He explained that in any swarm, you just have to find the leader. Once you take the leader down, he continued, the rest of the swarm becomes completely powerless. And just like that, a much larger, more imposing bee appeared. Before Chiguk could even finish his sentence, Beak Xiaohe was already on the move. The instructor was shocked. Somehow she had identified the leader instantly. Chiguk was impressed, congratulating her on a job well done. He explained that she must have sensed the leader's mana waves, which are different from the others. He admitted that sensing mana like that is difficult without a lot of experience. So, he offered to teach them an easier way to find the leader. Chiguk continued his lesson, explaining that one of the key traits of a leader monster is that they're often found alone. He pointed right at Woojin, who was kneeling by a tree, completely ignoring them. But Woojin wasn't thinking about monsters. He was thinking about food. He realized this dungeon had way more ingredients than the tutorial tower ever did. He'd found exactly what he was looking for, Fenestra mint. It was a rare herb that you could only find inside dungeons, so he made sure to collect it. Meanwhile, Chiguk was trying to impress Beak Xiaohe. He smugly offered her private lessons, mentioning that if she made a request through the Ju clan, he'd find the time. Xiaohe couldn't believe it. She wondered what Woojin had been doing this whole time. Most people would pay a fortune for personal lessons from a hunter like Chiguk, and this guy was just ignoring him. Finally, she'd had enough. She called out to Woojin, telling him to stop picking at the grass and keep up with the group. The instructor just sighed, complaining about how useless academy kids are. He muttered that if it were up to him, he'd just leave the idiot behind. Beak Xiaohe just watched him, her expression unreadable. She clearly didn't know what to make of her new partner. But as Beak Xiaohe watched him, she started to figure it out. She realized Woojin was a very by-the-book kind of person. He wasn't just messing around. He was strictly following the basics from a textbook called Dungeon Exploration 101. The #1 rule was to always understand the environment and the local creatures before moving forward. Chiguk, on the other hand, had finally lost his cool. He screamed at Woojin to stop messing around and follow them. But Woojin's little spirit was furious. How dare this guy interrupt the sacred ingredient collection time? The little guy was absolutely losing it. The instructor just shook his head, completely done with the situation. He told Xiaohe they were leaving him behind. Meanwhile, the little spirit was throwing punches that Chiguk couldn't even see. But Xiaohe hesitated. She didn't look comfortable with that idea at all. That's when a blue window suddenly appeared in front of everyone. The system popped up with info on killer bee honey. It wasn't for eating, but it could boost mana sensitivity if you put it on your skin. More importantly, it listed a bunch of recipes, and our boy was already taking notes. Meanwhile, Xiaohe and Chiguk were getting swarmed. They'd been in the dungeon for a while but still couldn't find the hive. Chiguk pointed out the annoying creatures and told Xiaohe to get ready. Woojin watched them from a distance. He figured even though the bees were huge, their behavior was pretty much the same as normal ones. Xiaohe drew her sword, looking annoyed. This was already the third swarm they'd had to deal with. Chiguk swung his spear, warning Xiaohe not to push herself too hard. He was worried she might get hurt, but she was determined to find that hive. Woojin, however, had come to a simple conclusion. Staying with these two was just slowing down his ingredient gathering. He figured they were skilled enough to handle things on their own. They weren't in any real danger. So, without a word, he turned and walked off into the woods. Back with the others, the ground was littered with defeated bees. It was the 15th one they'd taken down, but the swarms just kept coming. Even if you deal with one, there's still a huge pain in a group. Beak Xiaohe stood over the defeated monster, trying to catch her breath. The fight had taken a lot out of her. Chiguk had to admit if Xiaohe hadn't been there, things could have gotten really bad. He wiped down his spear, commenting on how annoying insect-type monsters were, even if you knew how to deal with them. Xiaohe let out a sigh. These bees were much more dangerous than she'd been told. Then a thought hit her: if she was struggling this much, what about Woojin? She quickly turned, scanning the area for him, but he was nowhere to be seen. Her eyes went wide, he was gone. Xiaohe finally found the instructor, Chiguk. He was just relaxing with his spear over his shoulders. She told him that Woojin wasn't with them. He just kept smiling, asking her to repeat that. So she said it again clearly. Woojin was gone. That's when he finally seemed to understand what she was saying. His entire expression changed, the smile vanished, and then he just exploded. He started screaming about how that clueless guy was always causing trouble. Xiaohe was completely taken aback. This guy was furious. He ranted that he never liked Woojin from the moment he saw him picking grass instead of actually hunting. With that, the two of them took off into the woods to find him. As they were running, a deafening buzz suddenly echoed through the forest. The sound was so intense, Chiguk grabbed his head, his eyes wide with shock. He knew this wasn't the sound of a regular killer bee. This was something else entirely. Even Beak Xiaohe had to cover her ears. The buzzing was that bad. That's when a massive, bright red system window appeared in the sky above them. Chiguk stared up at it, his face pale with shock. The message was clear. The killer bee queen, enraged by their presence, had just appeared. This F-rank dungeon suddenly had a boss. Meanwhile, Woojin was dealing with his own problems. A huge swarm of killer bees was buzzing right at him. But for him, this wasn't a problem at all. He cut through them effortlessly, thinking to himself that leaving the others was definitely the right call. He didn't even break a sweat. To him, this was just part of the job. With them gone, he could finally focus on what he came here for. He also noticed a sweet smell in the air, and it was getting stronger. The bees just kept coming, but Woojin wasn't annoyed. He figured that wherever they were coming from, there had to be some really valuable ingredients. He took a deep breath following the sweet scent. He knew exactly where to go. Without another word, he started walking. Quantum, the little fairy-like creature, had to rush to keep up, calling out for the chef to wait. He pushed aside some leaves and found the source. It was a dark cave entrance. This had to be the nest. Quantum couldn't believe it. It wondered how they could have possibly missed something so huge. Woojin just stood there calmly. He figured the cave was simply too deep inside the dungeon for anyone to have found it before. He explained that the only reason he found it was because his sense of smell was trained to detect ingredients like honey. As he stepped inside, he realized the cave was much deeper than it looked. A small smile spread across his face. For him, this wasn't dangerous at all. He was genuinely excited. He decided it was time to find out where that sweet smell was coming from. Without any hesitation, he walked deeper into the darkness. A moment later, Quantum yelled for the chef to look up. It was completely stunned. The thing was absolutely enormous, glowing with a golden light that filled the entire cave. This was the source of the honey. Quantum was losing its mind, calling the place a honey mine, and honestly, it wasn't wrong. The scale of this thing was unreal. Woojin had never seen a honeycomb this big, but his first thought wasn't about the value or the danger. He just wanted to know how it tasted. But just as he reached for it, a bright red system window flashed into existence right in front of him. The message was bad news. The killer bee queen, a C-rank boss, was enraged and had just appeared. Woojin's expression hardened. That's when he heard it, a loud buzzing coming from outside the cave. He didn't panic, his hand just moved to the hilt of his sword. Meanwhile, outside the cave, it was pure chaos. The instructor was running for his life, cursing his luck. He was furious with himself. If he hadn't been so lazy, he would have brought a tracker from the academy. Now they were in real trouble. The instructor was completely losing it, but he wasn't worried about Woojin's safety. Turns out he was terrified that if word got out he'd lost a cadet, his reputation would be ruined. All his hard work to get recognized by the Jew clan would have been for nothing. As they ran, Sialha suggested they split up to cover more ground. The instructor immediately shot her down, yelling at her for even thinking it. He told her if she disappeared too, they'd be in even bigger trouble. They just kept running, trying to get away from the swarm, but the bees were right on their tail. This clown was so busy yelling about how dangerous it is to split up. He was barely paying attention to the monsters chasing them. Sialha just had to go along with it. There was no time to argue while they were being chased. But then the instructor suddenly grabbed her arm. He pulled her behind a tree, telling her to hide immediately. They both took cover, peering out from behind the thick tree trunks. She started to ask what was going on, but the instructor quickly cut her off, telling her to be quiet. That's when they saw it. A massive bee way bigger than the others flew right past them. The forest went quiet for a second. This wasn't just some regular monster, it was a C-rank boss. The instructor was sweating bullets, he couldn't believe it. A C-rank boss had just appeared inside a F-rank dungeon. This was bad. Really, really bad. The instructor couldn't wrap his head around it. He thought the dungeon was going crazy. A boss that hadn't shown up in years was suddenly right in front of them. His mind was racing. He knew trying to take down a C-rank boss with a cadet who just became a hunter was basically a suicide mission. To even stand a chance against something like this, they'd need at least 3 B-rank hunters. And that's when the worst part hit him. Once a boss appears, the dungeon is sealed for 6 hours. That meant no help was coming. For the next 6 hours, they could either run away or die. He tried to get a grip, thinking about the reward he'd get from the Heavenly Wings Guild if he could just solve this. He told Sialha to stay calm, saying it was just a big bee and that they should slowly back away before it noticed them. But it was already too late. Sialha's face went pale. She whispered that it had already noticed them. The instructor froze. All that talk about sneaking away was useless now. The killer bee queen's massive armored head loomed over them. Its eyes were cold and empty. The instructor was completely frozen behind a tree, staring up at the giant creature. He cursed under his breath. This was a nightmare. They were completely outmatched. But he couldn't just stand there. He tightened his grip on his spear, ready to move. A moment later, the killer bee queen took to the sky, its wings buzzing loudly as it dove straight for them. The instructor snapped out of his fear and screamed at Sialha to turn and run. As they scrambled to get away, the massive shadow of the bee queen passed right over them. He yelled that its size was a weakness in the dense forest. They had to use the trees to slow it down. The plan to use the trees for cover was a complete bust. The monster just smashed right through them. It tore through a thick tree trunk like it was made of paper. Instructor Chiguk yelled for Sialha to fall back. He told her he'd buy some time so she could get ready for a big attack. With that, he took off, trying to draw the creature's attention to himself. His face went pale when he realized the bee wasn't even trying to go around the trees. It was just plowing straight through them to get to him. He knew this thing was way stronger than he'd thought. He needed a new plan and fast. But the killer bee queen didn't give him a chance to think. It tucked its body and dove straight at him like a missile. Chiguk barely managed to leap out of the way. The monster carved a huge trench into the ground right where he'd just been standing. The instructor knew he had to go all out. He gathered his energy, preparing his ultimate skill, the chain spiral spear. He channeled everything he had into the weapon, getting ready to unleash its first form. With a huge roar, he launched himself forward, putting all his strength into the attack. He called out the name of his skill as it slammed directly into the killer bee queen. The hit was clean, it was a perfect, direct strike. But when the dust settled, he couldn't believe it. His best move barely even cracked the monster's shell. He screamed at Sialha to run for her life. Sialha was confused by the sudden order. Chiguk yelled again, telling her he'd hold it off somehow, but she had to get away immediately. But she didn't move. Looking at her face, you could tell she had no intention of running away. Chiguk was still yelling at her to run away. But Sialha refused, telling him her father taught her to never turn her back on an enemy. With her sword at the ready, she announced that she was fighting too. The instructor couldn't believe it. He screamed at her, asking if she was crazy for trying to fight a C-rank boss. But it was too late. He saw the monster coming and yelled for her to watch out. The killer bee queen dove straight for them. It moved so fast it was just a blur of motion. The instructor hit the ground hard, thrown aside by the force of the attack. He looked up in panic, realizing Xiaohe was now the monster's only target. She braced herself, ready to face the full force of the queen's attack head-on. The queen lunged forward, but Xiaohe was just fast enough to leap out of the way. The sheer force of the blow sent her tumbling through the air. She managed to land on her feet and immediately brought her sword down on its head. But it was useless. The blade just bounced right off its shell. Xiaohe gritted her teeth. She told the instructor she could protect herself, but admitted her sword didn't even leave a scratch. This thing's armor was unbelievable. The instructor heard this and knew they couldn't win a long fight. He quickly came up with a plan. Xiaohe would distract the queen while he prepared a finishing blow with his spear. He told her he was going to pour every last bit of his mana into this one attack. They only had one shot to take this thing down. With that decided, the instructor began to gather his energy. A massive blue aura exploded around him, making the whole area shake. Xiaohe yelled that she understood. Without a moment's hesitation, she charged straight at the killer bee queen, ready to play her part. Xiaohe moved in, swinging her sword to keep the queen's attention locked on her. She parried a sharp leg, the force of the blow jarring her entire body. She kept weaving and dodging, staying just out of its reach. The plan was working. But then the monster suddenly stopped attacking, began to vibrate, letting out a strange high-pitched buzzing sound that echoed through the forest. Xiaohe looked up confused. This wasn't the sound of an attack. Her eyes widened. She realized the sound was completely different than before, and it sent a chill down her spine. That's when she saw them, a whole swarm of smaller killer bees descending from the sky. The queen had called for backup. Now she had to buy even more time for the instructor's attack. Xiaohe was completely swamped by the smaller bees. She swung her sword wildly, trying to fend them off, but there were just too many. But while she was distracted, something else was moving in. She looked up and her face went pale. It was the queen. The massive stinger was coming right for her, and she knew she was too late to get out of the way. But just then, a flash of blue energy shot past her. The instructor had finally made his move. He unleashed the second form of his chain spiral spear technique, a powerful move called Spiral Strike. The energy slammed into one of the smaller bees, sending it hurtling through it hit the ground so hard it kicked up a huge cloud of dirt. The instructor wasn't playing around. Xiaohe sat on the ground, completely out of breath. She looked over at the instructor, hoping his big attack had actually finished the job. The instructor, Chiguk, was panting too, but he had a confident smile on his face. He was sure his full-powered spiral strike was more than enough to take down a boss monster. He told her they needed to hurry and go find Wujin. But as he spoke, a huge shadow fell over Xiaohe. She looked up and her eyes went wide with fear. The instructor's smile vanished. His attack hadn't worked. The queen was still standing. The instructor's confidence shattered instantly. His ultimate move hadn't even scratched it. Xiaohe looked up, her face pale with fear. Before either of them could react, the queen moved. Its massive stinger shot down towards Xiaohe. The instructor screamed her name, but it was too late. The blow sent her flying backwards, knocking the sword right out of her hand. The instructor could only watch, completely powerless. With Xiaohe down, the monster turned its attention to him. He was next. He was completely out of energy. There was nothing he could do as the stinger came down for the final blow. Chiguk was cornered. He frantically tried to think of a way out, but there was nothing. He'd used up every last bit of his strength on that final attack. He couldn't fight anymore. All that effort he'd put in to get recognized, and it was all going to end in a place like this. In his panic, the instructor started blaming Wujin for the whole mess. Xiaohe was still unconscious on the ground. He thought if it wasn't for that kid, they could have just hidden and waited for the dungeon to open safely. He snapped out of it. The monster was focused on him, so he just had to find a way to save Xiaohe. But then he noticed something. The queen wasn't looking at him anymore. Its head was turned, focused on something else entirely. The massive creature just stood there, completely ignoring him, as if he wasn't even a threat. The queen was staring at someone walking calmly out of the woods. It was Chen Wujin. He didn't look scared at all. The instructor, Chiguk, completely lost it. He screamed at Wujin, demanding to know where he'd been and yelling at him to run for his life from the boss monster. But the killer bee queen didn't waste any time. It lunged forward, aiming its massive stinger right at Wujin. Chiguk yelled at him to stop standing there and run, cursing that he was too injured to move and help. But our boy didn't even flinch. He just stood there calmly as the attack closed in. The instructor screamed, absolutely certain that Wujin was about to die. And then the stinger made impact. The instructor screamed, absolutely certain that Wujin was done for. And then the stinger hit. Chiguk's eyes went wide. He couldn't process what he was seeing. For a second, everything went silent. Something exploded outwards with incredible force. And when the dust settled, Wujin was standing there without a scratch. The killer bee queen was sliced perfectly in two. The two halves of the massive creature dropped to the ground. It was over in a single clean strike. Our boy calmly flicked his sword like he was just getting rid of a bit of dust. The boss monster was nothing to him. The massive stinger, the monster's ultimate weapon, fell apart in mid. The instructor, Kim Chiguk, stared in absolute shock. Wujin, on the other hand, didn't even flinch as the pieces of the stinger fell harmlessly behind him. He calmly put his sword away. The job was done. Chiguk couldn't even begin to understand what he'd just seen. He sat there on the ground, his mind racing. He'd only brought Wujin along to try and getting good with the Heavenly Wings Guild. He never imagined the kid could actually slice the killer bee queen in half. He tried to make excuses in his head, wondering if the monster was already on the brink of death. Maybe he'd just gotten scared for no reason. But when he looked over, the sight in front of him made any excuse impossible. Wujin was just sitting there, casually, right between the two giant halves of the dead queen. Chiguk kept trying to rationalize it, but he knew the truth. The queen was injured, sure, but it still had more than enough power left to take him out. And yet this kid was acting like it was just another Tuesday. As Woojin crouched down, a couple of blue windows from the system popped up in front of him. That's when Chiguk's shock turned into pure rage. He was furious at Woojin for disappearing, then showing up at the last second to save the day. The anger quickly faded, replaced by cold panic. He was completely and utterly screwed. The poor guy was sweating bullets, his mind racing. Finally, after a long, awkward silence, Chiguk managed to speak. He nervously called out to Woojin, trying to ask how he'd managed to pull that off. But before he could finish, he let out a gasp. But instead of answering, Woojin just stood up and started walking away. Chiguk was left on the ground, completely stunned. He just watched him go, totally baffled. After everything that just happened, Woojin was just leaving. Then it hit him he'd completely forgotten about Seolha. He whipped his head around, shouting her name. He found her lying on the ground. He quickly checked her over and saw she was just unconscious, not in any real danger. Hilariously, his first thought was about how he could use this to score points with her later. He confirmed her internal mana was flowing normally. It was a huge relief. She was lucky to get out of that fight. With Seolha stable, his mind went right back to Woojin. He still had no idea what that was all about. It's when he saw it, a beehive. He wondered if that's really what Woojin had run off to get. And sure enough, there he was. Woojin walked back holding a plate with a perfect slice of honeycomb. He looked pretty satisfied, already planning his next step. Suddenly, a bunch of cooking equipment just appeared out of thin air. A pot, a steamer, even some tongs, all glowing with a green light. Then a portable stove popped into existence. Chiguk was completely floored. He realized Woojin had an inventory. He couldn't wrap his head around it. An inventory was incredibly rare. He wondered who could have possibly given Woojin something like that. He knew everyone Woojin associated with, and none of them had that kind of power. The only other explanation was insane, that Woojin had somehow managed to clear the 3rd floor of the tower all by himself. As Woojin started getting his ingredients ready, Chiguk's mind was racing. If he was that powerful, then none of this made any sense. Why would someone that strong not join a major guild? Why was he at the academy at all? He was getting a headache just trying to figure it out. But then, a horrible smell suddenly hit him. He looked over and saw steam rising from Woojin's setup. He couldn't imagine what on earth that crazy bastard was making to create such a disgusting stench. Chiguk pinched his nose, unable to stand the awful smell. He asked Woojin what in the world he was making. Our boy just smiled and said it was almost ready. And then Woojin presented his creation. It was a block of something teal, covered in glowing green slime and strange little mushrooms. It looked absolutely disgusting. Chiguk stared at it, sweating. He had no idea what he was even looking at. His mind was racing. He wondered if Woojin had actually cooked this thing or if it was just some kind of weird side effect from whatever he was doing. The instructor tried to make sense of it. Maybe Woojin could use alchemy. He guessed it had to be some kind of item that drove monsters away with its terrible smell. He looked closer. It looked like the beehive from the killer bees, but with mushrooms stuck all over it. And there were even weeds wrapped around the base. He wondered if maybe it was some kind of poison to use against the other bees. The smell alone seemed like it could take something down. But then he remembered the queen was already gone. There was no need for poison. This whole thing made absolutely no sense. Woojin held out the plate, offering the strange dish to Chiguk. The instructor's face went pale. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The poor guy was completely stunned. He was supposed to eat that thing. And then it clicked. This whole time, Woojin wasn't making some weird item. He was cooking. He suddenly wondered if Woojin had heard everything he'd been saying earlier. He stared at the dish, completely unsure of how to even begin. But he knew he didn't really have a choice. So the two of them just stood there, with Woojin patiently holding out the plate. Chiguk decided it was better to eat this thing than get torn apart. He just hoped he wouldn't actually die from it. The moment it hit his tongue, his body rejected it. He tried to force it down, but the poor guy genuinely felt like he was about to choke. The texture was all wrong. It was mushy and rubbery, and he thought it felt like maggots crawling in his mouth. And for a beehive dish, it was somehow bitter, not sweet at all. He grabbed his throat, completely fed up. He demanded to know what the hell Woojin had put in this thing. The instructor just collapsed to his knees, totally defeated. He was convinced this was Woojin's way of getting revenge. All he could think about was his mom's home-cooked meals. And that's when Woojin, with a perfectly pleasant smile, asked him how it tasted. The instructor just stared, thinking Woojin was an absolute psycho. But then Chiguk's eyes started to water. He was completely overwhelmed. The instructor, still on his knees, started sobbing. He admitted that somehow the disgusting food was actually delicious. But as he was having his breakdown, a blue window suddenly popped up right in front of him. He had no idea what was happening. Just hovered there in the air, waiting. Then the message appeared. The system told him he'd just eaten the neutralized venom of the killer bee queen and his poison resistance had permanently increased. Chiguk was floored. This wasn't just some weird dish, it was a buff item. He tried to make sense of it all. Did he get the buff because the food was made from a monster, or was it a reward for surviving the poison? His gaze shifted to Woojin, who was just standing there calmly. The instructor's entire understanding of this kid was shattered. He had to wonder, who exactly was Woojin? The blue window began to fade away, leaving only the quiet forest. Woojin was actually a little impressed. He hadn't expected Kim Chiguk to have a good enough sense of taste to recognize his skill. And just like that, a blue window popped up right in front of him. The system was giving him an achievement for creating a new dish, the Royal Beehive Herb Stew. It wasn't just one achievement either. He got another for it being a unique recipe and a third for its high rarity. Turns out, Chiguk's reaction was enough to earn him experience and rewards. Woojin knew exactly what made the dish so special. It was the killer bee queen's venom gland. He considered himself lucky to have found it. He knew adding the gland's sharp, tangy flavor to the sweet beehive would make the taste much deeper. He had created a dish that let someone experience almost every taste imaginable. To him, this was the absolute peak of cooking. With his daily quest complete, Woojin looked over at Seolha, still passed out on the grass. He figured it was time to go find some more ingredients. Little fairy spirit popped up, cheering that he was the best. Woojin didn't even smile. He just agreed because he knew it was true. A little while later, Seolha started to stir. She slowly pushed herself up, groaning. Her head was pounding. The last thing she remembered was the killer bee queen's surprise attack. After that, everything went black. Her eyes shot open as she looked around. And there it was, the killer bee queen. It was completely still. She couldn't believe it. She figured the instructor, Kim Chiguk, must have somehow finished it off. She was seriously impressed. That's when she heard a voice. It was Kim Chiguk, and he looked relieved to see she was finally awake. She called out to the instructor, confused. He was just eating. That's when she remembered that whatever he was eating had boosted her poison resistance. Kim Chiguk had a strange look on his face. He decided that even though Seolha seemed okay, she should eat some of the food just to be safe. Hilariously, his other reason was that the taste was so awful, he couldn't be the only one to suffer through it. Told her she needed to eat it to get her strength back, adding that Woojin was the one who made it. He held out the plate. It was some kind of strange green cake. Seolha looked at it for a second, then accepted it. She brought the weird-looking food to her mouth, ready to take a bite. Kim Chiguk watched her sweating. He was clearly waiting for her reaction. And off to the side, Woojin, the chef himself, just watched the whole thing quietly. Seolha started chewing. Kim Chiguk waited with a nervous smile. He was thinking to himself that it must taste like pure death, just like it did for him. But her reaction wasn't what he expected at all. A moment later, Seolha announced that it was delicious. Her eyes were literally sparkling. She exclaimed that she'd never tasted anything like it in her entire life. This completely broke Kim Chiguk. He just stared, stammering in disbelief. Behind him, Woojin watched the whole thing, looking like he expected this all along. Turns out this was a huge deal for Seolha. It brought back a memory from when she was younger. Her father was asking her how a special medicine tasted. Her dad, Baek Do-jang, was the guildmaster of Heavenly Wings. He explained that a friend had gone through a lot of trouble to get this for her. It was supposed to be incredibly sweet, a medicine that could bring back someone's sense of taste. But after a moment, she looked down, completely dejected. She told him she couldn't taste it. His hopeful smile completely vanished. He was crushed. She apologized to her dad, feeling like she'd let him down. She explained that she couldn't taste anything at all. Her father just knelt there, heartbroken for his little girl. He couldn't even look at her. The disappointment was too much. But Seolha tried to be strong for him. She said it was all right, because not being able to taste meant her other senses were even better. She took a bite, and for the first time in her life, she felt something. She finally understood what it was like to taste. A wave of pure happiness washed over her. In her entire 20 years, she had never experienced a feeling like this. She thought about all the money her father had spent, all the rare medicines he'd found for her. Nothing had ever worked before. Kim Chiguk, on the other hand, was completely baffled. He stammered, asking if she actually thought it tasted good. He wondered if the shock of the fight had broken her tongue. But she didn't even seem to hear him. She was lost in the moment, just repeating to herself that this is what taste felt like. This poor guy was completely lost. He had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. Meanwhile, outside the Nanguro station dungeon, a crowd of reporters and officials had gathered. They were all waiting anxiously because no one had come out yet. News alerts were already flashing across everyone's screens. They knew a B-rank hunter, Kim Chiguk, and 2 trainees were trapped inside with a C-rank boss. And according to the experts, their chance of survival was 0. A car pulled up near the dungeon entrance, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out. He walked right up to the glowing red gate and just stared at it. Turns out this was Baek Do-jang, the guildmaster of Heavenly Wings. He turned to his assistant, his voice heavy with worry, and asked if his daughter was going to be okay. The assistant tried to reassure him, telling him that of course she'd be fine. She was his daughter after all. That's when the reporters swarmed them. One of them shoved a recorder right in the guildmaster's face and asked how he felt about his daughter being trapped inside. His assistant immediately snapped, yelling at the reporter for asking such a rude question. The guy froze, completely shocked that he'd been called out. He just stood there stammering as the other reporters looked on. The disrespect was just unbelievable. The guildmaster was absolutely furious. His glare was enough to shut everyone up. His assistant looked completely stressed out. She tried to get him to calm down. She reminded him that everyone was watching, and he had to think about the guild's reputation. But the reporters were already getting annoyed, muttering about how rude he was being when they were all there out of concern. But he wasn't listening to any of them. His attention was locked onto something else entirely. That's when someone in the crowd shouted that the restriction on the dungeon had just been lifted. The glowing red gate suddenly turned a bright, swirling. Baek Do-jang and his assistant stared up at it, completely stunned. Without a second thought, the guildmaster took off, sprinting towards the gate. He screamed out his daughter's name, Seolha, begging for her to be okay. He didn't hesitate for a second, plunging straight into the swirling blue energy of the gate. For a moment, there was nothing but blinding light. And then 3 figures walked out. It was Seolha, the instructor, Kim Chiguk, and Woojin. The entire crowd of reporters went wild. They started screaming that all 3 of them had made it out alive. Her father grabbed her in a massive hug, shouting her name in pure relief. Seolha, completely fine, just complained that he was suffocating her. The crowd was buzzing, in awe that a B-rank hunter and 2 trainees had actually cleared a C-rank dungeon. That's when someone in the crowd pointed at the instructor, Kim Chiguk, specifically at the incredible spear he was holding. People started shouting, wondering if it was the boss's loot. A system window confirmed it, the Killer Bee Queen's spear, and its grade was unique. The effects were insane. It gave a boost to both strength and agility, and it came with a special skill, Killer Bee Queen's Venom. Any target hit by it would take constant poison damage. This wasn't just loot, it was a treasure. The crowd absolutely lost it, and unique grade item was a massive deal. To put it in perspective, items were graded from common and rare, all the way up to epic and legendary. And since only a handful of people in the entire country owned a legendary item, this was a huge discovery. A reporter immediately started shouting, demanding to know what happened inside the dungeon. Suddenly, the questions started flying from every direction. They all wanted to know how a B-rank hunter managed to defeat a C-rank boss. They asked about the boss monster, about how he kept the trainees safe. The poor guy was getting completely swamped. But Kim Chiguk was just confused. He knew he wasn't the one who should be answering these questions. Another reporter shoved his phone forward, asking him to confirm that he was the one who took down the boss all by himself. Kim Chiguk was completely overwhelmed by all the reporters. He knew he wasn't the hero they were making him out to be. Behind him, Woojin just watched everything unfold, silent as always. The poor guy started to sweat. He opened his mouth trying to set the record straight. But before he could say anything, the story had already spread. Miles away, the principal of the Hunter Academy was grinning from ear to ear. He'd been worried about the school's reputation, but this was the best news he could have asked for. He pulled up the article on his phone, which praised Kim Chiguk for taking down the boss with help from the Academy's trainees. The story went viral. News outlets from all over the world were picking it up. The comment sections, of course, were a total mess. Some people celebrated him as a new hero, while others called it fake news, arguing there was no way a B-rank hunter could solo a C-rank boss. Back in his office, the principal had to agree with the doubters. He knew Kim Chiguk's level. There was just no way he did it alone. He figured the guy must have gotten incredibly lucky. But honestly, he didn't care about the details. He just burst out laughing. Lucky or not, this was great for the academy, and he was glad they had hired him. He leaned back in his chair, feeling pretty good about how things had turned out. The principal's voice boomed from inside the office, welcoming them. Kim Chiguk, Sealha, and Woojin walked in. The principal greeted them like they were conquering heroes. Kim Chiguk just laughed awkwardly, telling the principal it was nothing. The man waved them over, telling them to sit down. He explained that he'd called them in to give them a certificate of appreciation and a bonus. But he also wanted to hear the full story of what actually happened inside that dungeon. Kim Chiguk just smiled and repeated what he told the reporters, that he couldn't have done it without Sealha and Woojin. He offered to start from the beginning, explaining how they thought it was just a simple F-rank dungeon at first. Then the instructor started telling his version of the story. He claimed that he was the one who confronted the monster to protect Sealha. All while Woojin, the guy who actually did everything, just sat there listening. As Kim Chiguk finished his tale, the other staff member in the room looked completely shocked. He repeated the instructor's claim that they had barely managed to injure the boss. Sealha, on the other hand, was not impressed. She knew that wasn't how it happened at all. The man continued talking with the principal, completely buying the instructor's story. All the while, Sealha and Woojin just sat there in silence. The principal listened to the whole thing and admitted that it sounded strange. But Woojin, the guy who actually saved everyone, didn't seem to care. He just calmly picked up his cup of tea. The bald instructor let out a heavy sigh, clearly concerned by what he'd heard. The principal agreed, saying they were lucky the instructor was there to handle it. He warned that they needed to be prepared for more strange events like this in the future. As he spoke, the principal's eyes landed on Woojin. He couldn't shake the feeling that the trainee looked familiar for some reason. Turns out the other instructor was thinking the same thing. He felt a familiar aura from Woojin and remembered hearing rumors about a trainee who encourages people to eat bizarre food. The principal froze. The rumors about a weird trainee suddenly connected to something far more terrifying in his mind. He remembered stories of an ancient, overwhelming power, the aura of a legendary sect leader. And the thought that hit him was absolutely insane. Could this trainee be that person? The other instructor noticed his sudden change in expression and asked him what was wrong. The poor guy was so stunned he couldn't even answer. He just stared into space, sweating. Seeing his colleague completely frozen, the man leaned in and asked again if he was okay. The principal snapped out of it. He quickly tried to play it cool, telling everyone they'd worked hard and should go get some rest. With that, the awkward meeting was finally over. While the principal was having a complete meltdown in his head, Woojin just stood there, perfectly calm. The door clicked shut behind the other instructor, finally ending the awkward meeting. The principal turned to the trainees and told them he was heading out first. He praised Sealha for her hard work and told her to get a checkup at the hospital, just in case. Then he turned to Woojin and said he should get going too. Woojin just nodded and said he was leaving. But just as our boy was about to walk out, the principal suddenly yelled for him to wait. The principal's mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. He figured Woojin was about to ask for some kind of reward now that the dungeon clear was all over the news. But then it hit him. Woojin hadn't said a single thing. He hadn't asked for anything, which made the whole situation even weirder. The principal pointed to the Killer Bee Queen's spear. He reminded Woojin that he'd said he didn't need the boss's loot. He asked if Woojin was serious about not wanting the unique equipment. Woojin just looked at him and said flat out that he didn't need it. The principal's mind started racing. He remembered how Woojin didn't even say much in front of all the reporters. In fact, he was the one who had to spin a whole story about them crying from despair while facing death. He couldn't understand why Woojin, who wasn't interested in fame or loot, was suddenly asking for his phone number. The principal started sweating, completely confused by the sudden change. A wave of unease washed over him. He couldn't figure out why Woojin would want to contact him. Woojin just smiled and held out a card, telling the instructor he'd treat him to a meal next time. And that was it. The poor guy's face went pale. He was totally screwed. Woojin was silently fuming. He couldn't believe the instructor had called his food that. The guy clearly had no idea what a proper meal even was. As the instructor shuffled away looking like a ghost, he was obviously wondering what kind of trouble he was in now. Woojin and the little fairy spirit just watched him go. The little spirit, on the other hand, was absolutely losing it. She started yelling about how arrogant that guy was, reminding everyone that Woojin was the one who defeated the killer bee queen. Woojin just listened calmly. He explained that people always tend to look at the ones with the biggest reputation first, and that's exactly why he never wanted the spotlight. It would only get in the way of his cooking. Now that he had new ingredients and recipes, he figured it was time to head back. The little fairy was still grumbling, calling everyone fools because they didn't understand the true worth of her chef. The next day at the academy, the classroom was buzzing. Everyone was talking about what happened in the dungeon. One of the students ran right up to Woojin, shoving his phone in his face. He yelled, asking if the news article about the dungeon was actually true. The article was all over the news. It said a B-rank hunter named Kim Chiguk had taken down a C-rank boss, with some help from the students. Of course, it mentioned how rare it was for a boss that strong to even show up in a tutorial dungeon. Not satisfied, the student then immediately asked about Beexialha, wanting to know how she did. The other students were all talking about how amazing Kim Chiguk and Beexialha were. One of them even turned to Woojin, asking just how strong Kim Chiguk was in person. But our boy wasn't listening to any of it. He was just thinking about his daily quest, wondering who he should feed today to clear it. Just then, the professor for dungeons and traps walked in and told everyone to take their seats. The professor explained that today they were going to review the practice sessions by watching the videos. Woojin listened, his expression unreadable. The professor announced they were going to review the practice videos, starting with a student named Kim Hyunsung. The video played and right away the student was caught in a smoke trap. He immediately started to panic, completely losing his cool. The professor didn't hold back. He told the student that if this were a real situation, he'd be dead. He explained that the first thing you do in smoke is hold your breath and figure out what's going on. The poor guy just lowered his head, sweating. He quietly apologized for his mistake. The professor continued, reminding him that in the real world anything can happen. His life would depend on being careful. He sighed, muttering to himself about the upcoming tournament. He was worried, seeing them fail at even the most basic traps. He just stood there at the podium looking completely exhausted. A heavy silence fell over the classroom. The moment just hung there unresolved. The professor started talking about the hunter tournament. It's a huge competition for any hunter who's passed the tutorial tower in the last year, and it gets a ton of attention from the big guilds. The problem was their academy hadn't had a good showing in that tournament for the last 10 years. The pressure was definitely on. He let out a long sigh. He knew there was still time to teach them, but it felt like a huge challenge. Still, he had no choice but to continue the class. Finally, some good news. He pulled up Beexialha's video. She scored in a plus 98 points. The professor was impressed, telling her she was so skilled it was strange she was even still at the academy. Next up was Jo Seung-jun, another A+, this time with 92 points. The professor called his performance perfect. A wave of relief washed over the professor. At least there were a few students who gave him some hope for the tournament. That's when the professor looked down his list and called out the next name, Chin Woojin. Our boy stood up and confirmed it was his turn. The professor sat there thinking, he just couldn't figure Chin Woojin out. The guy's strength and his weird decision to join the academy didn't add up at all. He'd been watching him since he arrived, but all Woojin ever did was cook. He knew the kid wouldn't show his full power in a simple test like this. Still, he made a mental note to keep a close watch on him, just in case. But when he looked up, Woojin's seat was already empty. The professor called out his name, but he was already long gone. Turns out, our boy had already left the academy and was standing in front of a dungeon. Without any hesitation, he just pushed the door open and went inside. He stepped into the dungeon, the door slammed shut behind him. And just like that, a message popped up on the professor's screen: you died. The result was immediate. Chin Woojin, F rank 0 points. He didn't even last a second. The professor just stared at the score, completely speechless. He had absolutely nothing to say to this guy. Back in the classroom, the little spirit was losing her mind. She started yelling at the professor, furious that he would dare insult her chef. She kept screaming about how he was obviously failing on purpose, but she just couldn't figure out why. Meanwhile, another student just sat there, watching the whole thing unfold with a grim look on his face. Later in the academy dining hall, the other students were already talking. One of them slammed his tray down, complaining that if it wasn't for that crazy bastard, he wouldn't even be there. The student continued his rant, complaining about some guy who pulled a knife on them. He was convinced that if it wasn't for that one person, they would have cleared the 3rd floor of the tower. His friend chimed in, saying they were lucky to have passed it all. Otherwise, they would have gone after the guy who messed things up. The biggest guy in the group added his 2 cents. He threatened to take care of the student if he ever saw him again, then started complaining about the professor for the Dungeons and Traps class. Turns out these guys were known as the Hopeless Trio. Their leader kept running his mouth, calling the professor a loser who was stuck at the academy acting like he was important. And he wasn't the only one who felt that way. Elsewhere, another student was thinking the exact same thing. He believed all the academy instructors were the same, people who couldn't recognize real skill because they were just low-level hunters themselves. Back in the dining hall, the leader of the trio suddenly stopped. He looked down our plate, completely confused by what he was seeing. It was some kind of salad, covered in a weird blue dressing and what looked like chocolate. He couldn't believe his eyes, a choco salad. And that's when he slammed his hands on a table, getting right in someone's face. The person he decided to pick a fight with, our boy Chin Woojin. The leader of the trio was about to call the food garbage, but he stopped dead in his tracks. The person sitting there was Chin Woojin. The other two clowns started sweating immediately. One of them whispered that they knew who that was, but their leader just hissed at him to shut up. The guy was absolutely drenched in a cold sweat. So now the four of them were just sitting there. The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife. His mind was racing, he was sure of it. Woojin remembered them. He knew that if they gave Woojin even the slightest reason, they were completely done for. The little spirit was confused. She asked Woojin why those guys were making such a big deal while eating and wondered if he knew them. Our boy admitted he wasn't sure. As Woojin tried to remember where he'd seen them, the two guys were forcing themselves to eat, one even letting out a super awkward laugh. They looked familiar, but he just couldn't place them. He slid a salad over to their table. He explained it was made with blue slime dressing and topped with chocolate chips. The guys couldn't believe it, he'd actually put a monster in their food. The leader of the group stared at the plate, his face pale. He was seriously wondering if this stuff was even safe to eat. Suddenly, a terrifying Grim Reaper-like figure appeared behind Woojin. Our boy just calmly told the guy to eat, saying it was tasty. This was clearly not a request. Woojin was smiling, but the Reaper's giant scythe was now hovering right over the guy's neck. The dude was sweating buckets, cursing Woojin under his breath as he realized he had no choice but to take a bite. The poor guy was shaking. He figured he'd rather eat this thing than get beaten up again. He just really hoped it wouldn't be the last thing he ever ate. He took a bite. Instantly, his eyes shot wide open in shock. A huge blast of icy energy erupted from his mouth. He started screaming that his mouth was on fire, wondering if he'd just eaten salad dressing or a bottle of mouthwash. The guy felt like he'd just swallowed an entire mint. A crazy, icy feeling was washing over his whole body. But then the sweet taste of chocolate kicked in. He was totally confused. Was this supposed to be mint chocolate? No, he finally decided. It wasn't mint chocolate, it was mouthwash chocolate. The other students in the cafeteria just stared, completely bewildered by the weird noises coming from their table. They couldn't imagine what kind of food would make someone react like that. A moment later, the entire group just collapsed onto the table, completely taken out by the salad. Woojin watched them with a small, satisfied smile. He was genuinely happy to find customers who could truly appreciate his cooking. Woojin asked if he liked the taste. The poor guy on the table tried to deny it, but his body was telling a completely different story. But he couldn't lie to himself, he finally admitted it. The food was delicious. Sometime later, the story shifts to a classroom setting. A new professor, Lee Yongshik, stood at the front of the lecture hall. He introduced himself as the teacher for understanding dungeons and their types. He immediately set the tone, warning everyone that his attendance policy was strict. Miss 3 classes and you'd be kicked out of the course. He told the students that if they just followed along, the class would help them with their first exam, which was only 3 weeks away. But the students in the back weren't buying it. They whispered to each other, wondering what the point was, figuring it was just another useless lecture. The professor then asked if anyone had questions. Hearing only silence, he adjusted his glasses and got ready to start the class. The professor continued his lecture, moving on to the next topic, the Goblin Lair at Nanhyeon Station. He warned them that while people called it a sweet dungeon, it was actually very dangerous for new hunters. The real threat wasn't the goblins, but the mud golems that appeared with them. Woojin, however, was actually impressed. He thought the lecture was well organized, and the professor's personal stories made it interesting. The professor then moved on to E-rank dungeons, bringing up the famous Wild Boar's Wilderness. Instantly, the little fairy spirit popped out, shouting that wild boar is a real delicacy. That one word was all it took to get Woojin's full attention, wild boar. His mind immediately started working. He imagined it would have a strong, gamey flavor. The thought alone got him excited. The professor continued, explaining that the dungeon was also called a gold mine because the iron ore found there sold for a high price. But he warned them the place was huge, and a lot of people who went in never came out. He finished by saying that because the wild boars travel in groups, it was way too dangerous for trainees. Entry was strictly forbidden. Hearing this, the little fairy looked crushed, realizing they couldn't get their hands on that delicious meat. The little fairy sighed, completely defeated. There was just no way for them to get to that dungeon. But the professor added that there was one way. You could go with the principal's approval, though he strongly advised against it for new trainees. That's all our boy needed to hear, the principal. A light bulb went off in his head. Miles away in his office, a man named Guak Kai Elon let out a sudden sneeze. He had no idea he was about to get a very interesting visitor. The principal, Wantum Shans, took a sip from his cup, his mind racing. He couldn't figure out why on earth this kid was here. Woojin sat calmly in the principal's office. He politely thanked the man for seeing him on such short notice. Wantum Shans just cut to the chase and asked him what he wanted. He started sweating a little, wondering if this was about the Killer Bee dungeon. He thought maybe the kid was here about the reward money, but he quickly dismissed that idea. Something about this guy just felt wrong. He remembered Woojin's records. He was a trainee who wasn't particularly good at anything. The more the principal looked, the more he saw something else entirely. He started to see a disturbing resemblance to his old sect leader. And then, a faint but unmistakable aura began to leak from Woojin. Wantum Shans's eyes shot wide open in pure terror. There was no mistaking it. This was the sect leader's aura. The aura filled the room, it was suffocating. The principal was sweating, completely terrified. He stammered, demanding to know where Woojin learned that technique. Woojin started his story. He explained that when he was young, he traveled to Baekdu Mountain. He said he slipped and got stranded but stumbled upon a cave. Inside, he found a chest with an old book, which turned out to be a martial arts manual. The principal listened, but something didn't add up. He wondered why the sect leader would leave a manual on Baekdu Mountain and not on Mount Tiantian. He remembered how his sect leader was always disappointed that his followers couldn't grasp his teachings. So the idea that he'd just leave a manual lying around was hard to believe. But that aura, there was no denying that Woojin's power was real. Quantum Shans considered everything. The story was wild, but the evidence was sitting right in front of him. The principal's voice was low. He realized Woojin knew he would sense that powerful. He asked if Woojin had released it on purpose just to get his attention. Woojin admitted it. He explained that the manual he found had a detailed description of someone called the Blood Demon. After seeing the principal's power, he figured they must have learned the same martial arts. The principal was stunned. He couldn't believe Woojin had figured out his techniques just by reading a book. Woojin just smiled and said the manual was simply that well written. The principal seemed to accept this. He knew his old master never did anything half-heartedly, so the manual must have been perfect. He sighed, ready to hear the rest. With that settled, he got down to business. He asked Woojin if he came all this way just to tell him that story. That's when Woojin finally revealed his true goal. He asked for permission to enter the wild boar's wilderness. The principal thought about it for a moment. He told Woojin that while the dungeon was usually off-limits, he'd make an exception because of his martial arts. But of course, there was a catch. He wanted Woojin to share more details about the manual he'd found. He told Woojin to go to the wilderness first and come back later to talk. Turns out, even the principal had to clock out on time. The principal then asked a final question: who did Woojin plan on going with? Meanwhile, somewhere else, the mood was much darker. A man stood looking out over the city lights. He asked his subordinate if something had happened in the Killer Bee dungeon. The man on the floor looked down, confirming that something had. He called the other man master. His hand was clenched into a tight fist. Whatever happened in that dungeon, it wasn't good. The man in the shadows exhaled, his mind clearly on what he'd just learned. He dismissed the man on the floor. Turns out this was Ju Yomyung, the head of the powerful Ju clan. The subordinate bowed deeply, accepting his master's command without question. The subordinate turned and began to walk away. As he left, his master's voice followed him, telling him he'd done a good job. The subordinate, whose name was Chuentum, thanked his master for the praise. With that, he walked out of the room, leaving the head of the Ju clan alone with his thoughts. Chuentum was absolutely thrilled. He'd actually gotten praised. And it wasn't just from anyone, it was from his master, who almost never gave compliments. Feeling good, he decided he should go out for a drink to celebrate. But just as he was thinking that, a message popped up on his phone. It was from Chin Woojin. His good mood vanished instantly. Woojin wanted to go to the wild boar's wilderness. Chuentum started scrambling for an excuse, anything to get out of it. A dungeon exploration, a friend's wedding. Then something clicked. He remembered seeing that dungeon name in the rulebook before. To enter the wild boar's wilderness, you needed special permission from the principal. On top of that, you needed a team of 3 to enter. And there was no way they'd let Xiaohe go, especially since she was still recovering from an injury. He had the perfect out. He happily messaged Woojin back, pretending to be disappointed that they were blocked by 2 different regulations. Feeling relieved, he suggested they just go for a drink instead. But then he paused. He was dealing with Chin Woojin, a guy who didn't give up easily. Chuentum thought he was so clever, but Woojin's reply was simple: see you tomorrow. Attached was a permission slip, signed by the principal, authorizing Chin Woojin to enter the dungeon with 1 observer. Chuentum couldn't believe it. This guy had somehow gotten the principal's approval in minutes. And so they arrived at the E-rank dungeon, the Wild Boar's Wilderness. It's a place usually filled with low-rank hunters, the kind of people who couldn't quite make it on the front lines. The reason they all come here is for one thing: a valuable material called bright metal. This stuff is so good that even B-rank hunters use weapons made from it, which makes it a really good way to make money. As they walked, Chuentum was completely lost. He couldn't understand why someone with Woojin's incredible skills would bother coming here. Was it for the ore? The kid was already amazing without it. Finally, he decided to just ask him what was going on, because they'd been here for a little while now, and all Woojin had done was wander around picking up weeds. Chuentum just stood there completely baffled. They were in a dangerous dungeon, and all Woojin seemed to care about were the weeds on the ground. Finally, the observer had enough and called out to him. He tried to make sense of the situation, explaining that the bright metal ore mine was just a short walk away. He figured that had to be why they were here. But Woojin just gave him a blank stare. Turns out that wasn't the reason at all. This was the last straw for Chuentum, who was about to lose his mind from the confusion. Woojin turned to the little spirit and admitted he had no idea there was even a mine here. The fairy seemed impressed, noting that the observer must be pretty knowledgeable. Chuentum couldn't believe what he was hearing. He asked if Woojin was serious. He really didn't know about the mine, and Woojin just confirmed it like it was nothing. This completely broke the observer's brain. If they weren't here for the one valuable thing in the entire dungeon, then why come at all? He ran through the possibilities trying to figure it out. But by the time he looked up, Woojin was gone. He had just vanished into thin air, leaving Chuentum completely alone and wondering where the hell he went. The observer, Chuentum, was sprinting as fast as he could. Something about this whole situation felt completely wrong. He couldn't understand it. Woojin was just walking normally, but somehow he was impossibly fast. Woojin, on the other hand, was just taking a casual stroll through the dungeon. The poor guy finally caught up and just collapsed, completely out of breath. He still had no idea what Woojin was even looking for. He was completely drained, just trying to process what was happening. That's when Woojin happily announced that he'd found something edible. Chuantum looked up and he couldn't believe his eyes. After all that running, this dude was just smiling at a cactus. But then a blue window popped up. Turns out this wasn't just any cactus. It was an ingredient for something called king slime sherbet. The system window showed a recipe: bright metal ore centum cactus grill. The problem was one of the ingredients, the ore, wasn't registered yet. He had to find it. Chuantum finally put it together. This whole trip was about finding ingredients for some weird cactus recipe. He started to demand an explanation, but Woojin cut him off, asking where the ore was. The observer was completely lost, yelling at him to be clearer. Woojin just calmly repeated his question. He needed to know where the bright metal ore was. The poor guy looked like he was about to explode. He snapped, yelling that he'd already told Woojin where to find it. Completely defeated, Chuantum repeated that the ore was in the southwest. Woojin just gave a quick thanks and turned to leave. Chuantum tried to scold him for not listening, but he was talking to thin air. Our boy was already gone, a blur heading straight for the southwest. Chuantum couldn't believe his eyes. Woojin was already just a tiny dot in the distance. The poor guy was completely gassed, struggling just to catch his breath. By the time Chuantum finally caught up, Woojin was just standing there, not even breathing hard. He'd covered a 40-minute run in just 5 minutes. Woojin looked at the entrance and stated that this was the Chuantum was just baffled. With that kind of power, Woojin could go anywhere. So why was he wasting his time at the academy? Without another word, our boy headed straight for the dark entrance of the mine. Just as he reached the entrance, a man stepped out from the darkness. He looked at Woojin and asked what a kid was doing there. The guy looked pretty rough. He told Woojin this was no place for him and that he should just turn around and go back. Turns out this was Mun Hyunsik, a veteran miner who worked in this area. Just then, a whole crew of miners walked out. Their leader stood with his arms crossed, looking annoyed. He was muttering about how he didn't need another headache today. This guy immediately started yelling, demanding to know why they were just standing there. One of the other miners recognized the loudmouth right away. He nervously pointed out to his friend that it was Kim Chiguk. Meanwhile, Chuantum was just happy he could finally breathe again. The big miner scoffed, questioning why anyone who could afford to buy the ore would ever bother coming to the mine themselves. Chuantum finally caught up and saw the tense standoff. He leaned over to Woojin, quietly explaining that this guy, Kim Chiguk, was known for having a terrible temper. Thinking fast, Chuantum put on a friendly smile and greeted the hunter politely. Kim Chiguk just gave a simple hello back. Kim Chiguk claimed he was just giving Woojin a friendly warning about the dangers inside. Chuantum just nodded and thanked him, shaking his hand to keep the peace. The little fairy was fuming, calling the miners fools, but Woojin didn't care at all. As long as they could get inside, it was fine. Kim Chiguk tried to play it off, claiming he only spoke harshly to make sure they stayed safe. This clown then turned to his own crew and started screaming at them, demanding they get out of the way. The other miners immediately scrambled, clearing a path for them to enter the cave. Kim Chiguk just nodded, smugly saying he'd accept their kindness. With that finally settled, Woojin and Chuantum walked into the darkness of the mine. As they left, one of the miners asked his boss if it was really okay to let them in. Kim Chiguk just scoffed, telling him to shut it. He was sure they'd just come back empty-handed anyway. Chuantum, however, was having the time of his life. He threw his head back and laughed, sarcastically talking about how nice it was to be so respected. The little fairy just gave him a deadpan look, completely over his antics.